Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a hushed workshop where candlelight flickers across mountains of luminous pearls, and your fingers ache from threading silk through holes smaller than pinpricks. You can hear the whisper of satin against wooden frames, the collective held breath of 30 women bent over embroidery hoops, and somewhere in the distance, the muffled chime of a palace clock reminding everyone that the royal wedding is only 47 days away. The air smells of beeswax, rosewater, and something else nervous anticipation mixed with the faint saltiness of pearls that crossed oceans to arrive here. You're about to discover how royal seamstresses transformed bolts of ivory fabric into legendary gowns that sparked envy across continents, one painstaking stitch at a time. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why certain royal portraits show brides literally glowing, or why wedding dress preservation became an obsession bordering on paranoia. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video. Or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or maybe share your own family's wedding traditions. I love hearing from you, and your support keeps these stories coming to life week after week. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible, turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're standing in the year 1840 in a private suite of Buckingham Palace, watching history prepare itself. Queen Victoria's wedding dress hangs on a dressmaker's dummy, and already it's causing headaches. The young queen, barely 21 years old, has declared she wants her gown to represent British craftsmanship entirely, which means every thread must come from English mills, every lace scrap from English bobbins, and every pearl from territories under the Crown's dominion. No French silks allowed, no Belgian lace. This nationalistic fervour might sound romantic until you realise it just tripled the difficulty of sourcing materials and quintupled the pressure on the seamstresses who must make it all work together flawlessly. The dress itself is a modest design by royal standards. Victoria specifically requested simplicity over ostentation, preferring delicate Honiton lace to jewel-encrusted brocade. But here's where things get complicated. Simplicity in royal fashion doesn't mean easy. It means every single element must be absolutely perfect, because there's nowhere to hide mistakes. And Victoria, perhaps inspired by her grandmother's pearl collection or simply enchanted by their moonlit glow, has decided that thousands of seed pearls should be hand-stitched onto the lace overlay, creating patterns of orange blossoms and roses that will shimmer as she walks down the aisle of the Chapel Royal. Thousands, not hundreds, thousands. The head seamstress, a woman named Mrs. Bettinson, who runs the royal wardrobe with military precision, nearly fainted when she heard the specification. Seed pearls, those tiny spheres barely larger than grains of rice, are notoriously difficult to work with. They're fragile, expensive, and attaching them securely to delicate lace without tearing the fabric requires a level of skill that perhaps 24 women in all of England possess. Mrs. Bettinson immediately begins calculating if each pearl takes approximately 4 minutes to properly secure, including the time to select it for colour match. Thread the needle with silk fine enough not to damage the pearl's drill hole. Make the stitches and verify it's firmly attached, and they need roughly 6,000 pearls for the design Victoria has approved. They're looking at 400 hours of pearl work alone. That's not counting the actual construction of the dress, the lace application, the endless fittings, or the terror-inducing final inspections. Do you feel the weight of expectation settling onto your shoulders because you're about to become one of the chosen seamstresses? Selected from the most prestigious dressmaking houses in London for your steady hands and flawless reputation, you've spent 15 years perfecting your craft, starting as a young apprentice learning to thread needles in dim light, graduating to hemming petticoats, then finally earning the privilege of working on visible seams for countesses and duchesses. But this is different. This is the Queen of the British Empire, and every newspaper in Europe will print descriptions and sketches of her gown. Any mistake you make will be whispered about in courts from Madrid to St. Petersburg. The pearls arrive in small wooden boxes lined with velvet, delivered under guard from the royal treasury. You're allowed to touch them only after washing your hands with unscented soap. The natural oils from human skin can, over time, dull a pearl's luster. Each pearl has already been inspected for quality. Sorted by size, they range from 2 mm to 4 mm in diameter, and organised into trays by subtle colour variations. Yes, variations to the untrained eye. All the pearls look creamy white, but you've been taught to see the whisper of pink in some, the hint of silver in others, the rare ones with an almost golden glow. Matching these tones correctly so the finished pattern looks harmonious rather than patchy is an art that can't be rushed. Here's something most people don't realise: pearls used in 1840 weren't the cultured pearls we know today. Every single one came from a wild oyster, pried open by a diver who risked his life in the waters off Ceylon or the Persian Gulf. More on those divers. Later their story will break your heart. This means each pearl is genuinely unique, with its own personality quirks. Some have tiny surface imperfections. Others have slightly irregular shapes. The very finest ones, the ones destined for the most visible parts of Victoria's dress. The ones that will catch light in portrait paintings for centuries. Those are so perfect they seem to emit their own soft glow, as if they've trapped moonlight inside their calcium layers. You pick up your first pearl, feeling its cool smoothness against your fingertip, and thread your needle with silk so fine it's almost invisible. The pattern you're working on depicts an orange blossom, symbol of fertility and eternal love. Victorian wedding symbolism was not subtle. Each petal requires 7 pearls arranged in a specific curve, and the centre needs 9 smaller ones clustered tightly together. You'll be working on orange blossoms for the next 3 weeks, and by the end, you'll see them in your dreams, which isn't necessarily a complaint. There's something meditative about repetitive, precise work, especially when you know it's contributing to something that will be remembered for generations. The workshop is quiet except for the sound of needles sliding through fabric and the occasional murmured consultation between seamstresses about thread tension or pearl placement. No one hums or sings that's forbidden because it might lead to distraction and mistakes. No one gossips about their families or the latest society scandals. Though you're all dying to discuss the rumours about Prince Albert's nervousness, apparently he's been pacing the palace corridors at night, terrified of making some diplomatic gaffe during the ceremony. The silence is almost sacred, broken only when Mrs. Bettinson makes her rounds, inspecting each woman's progress with eyes that miss nothing. She can spot a pearl attached with insufficient stitches from 3 feet away, and she's not shy about making you redo work that doesn't meet her standards. Historians still argue whether Victoria's choice of a white wedding dress, unconventional at the time, most brides wore their best dress in any colour, was a political statement about purity and the new Victorian morality, or simply a practical choice to showcase the British lace industry. But there's no debate about this. Her decision to cover that dress in thousands of hand-stitched pearls changed wedding fashion forever, spawning a tradition of pearl-adorned bridal gowns that persists to this day. Every modern bride wearing pearls is, in some small way, echoing what you're creating right now in this candlelit room in 1840. Your first orange blossom is complete, and you hold it up to catch the light. The pearls gleam softly, creating subtle shadows and highlights that make the flat lace suddenly look three-dimensional, alive. It's beautiful, genuinely, breathtakingly beautiful, and you've only stitched 16 pearls so far. 5,984 to go. The selection process that brought you to this royal workshop began 6 months before Victoria's engagement was even publicly announced. Mrs. Bettinson, with her network of informants spanning every respectable dressmaking establishment in London, had heard whispers that a proposal was imminent. She started compiling her list immediately, because finding seamstresses capable of royal quality work isn't like posting an advertisement in the Times and waiting for applications. You need women with reputations so impeccable that their former employers write references using words like transcendent and unparalleled. You need hands that never tremble, eyes that can work by insufficient light without squinting, and temperaments calm enough to handle the suffocating pressure of knowing that one visible mistake could end your career permanently. The initial list contained 47 names. Mrs. Bettinson personally visited each woman's workshop, unannounced, posing as a wealthy merchant's wife seeking a ball gown. She watched how they interacted with demanding clients, how they handled fabric, whether they cut corners when they thought no one important was watching. She examined their finished work with a magnifying glass she kept hidden in her reticule, looking for thread tension inconsistencies or stitches that were even slightly uneven. By the time she finished her covert investigations, only 19 names remained on her list. These were women who treated every garment, whether for a duchess or a doctor's wife, with the same meticulous attention to detail. Then came the secret interviews, conducted in a nondescript building near St. James's Palace. You remember that day with crystalline clarity. The summons arrived via courier, sealed with unmarked wax, instructing you to present yourself at a specific address at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon. No explanation. No mention of what the opportunity entailed, just a terse command to bring samples of your finest work and to tell no one about the appointment. You arrived 15 minutes early, clutching a portfolio containing a christening gown you'd made for a baronet's daughter, every stitch invisible. The embroidery so delicate it looked like frost patterns on a window pane, and an evening bodice with beadwork that had taken you 40 hours to complete. The waiting room contained 12 other women, all of whom you recognised by reputation if not by face. Margaret Thornbury, who'd done the trousseau for 3 earls' daughters, Elizabeth Chen, whose mother had emigrated from Canton and taught her daughter embroidery techniques that blended English and Chinese traditions into something entirely unique, Sarah Blackwood, famous or perhaps infamous for once refusing to deliver a dress to a countess because the woman had requested modifications that would compromise the garment's structural integrity. Seeing them there, you realised this wasn't an interview for just any position. This was something extraordinary. Mrs. Bettinson appeared and led you, one by one, into a private chamber where she conducted what can only be described as an interrogation disguised as a conversation. She asked about your training, your influences, your methods for achieving invisible hems. She presented you with a scrap of silk and challenged you to mend a deliberate tear so seamlessly that she couldn't find it. Afterward you succeeded. Barely. She showed you a pearl, just one, cupped in her palm, and asked how you would attach it to tulle without tearing the netting. When you explained your technique of using a backing stitch through a tiny square of silk organza to distribute the weight, She nodded slowly, and you saw the faintest flicker of approval in her eyes. But here's the really interesting part. She also asked questions that had nothing to do with sewing. Could you keep secrets, even from your own family? How did you handle criticism? Had you ever worked on a project that failed? And what did you learn from it? Would you be willing to work in isolation, separated from friends and regular clients? For potentially 3 to 4 months, did you have any political affiliations or strong religious views that might compromise your discretion? This last question seemed odd until you understood its purpose. Royal households live in terror of information leaks, especially details that foreign courts or gossip columnists could exploit. A seamstress with loose lips about royal measurements, or who might be tempted to sell stories to newspapers for extra income, was utterly unacceptable. From those 19 candidates, Mrs. Bettinson selected 12. You were the 11th name on her final list. Chosen not because you were the most talented, you suspected Margaret Thornbury held that distinction, but because your combination of skill, discretion, and psychological stability made you ideal for sustained, high-pressure work. The official offer arrived 3 days later. You would be employed as a royal seamstress for Queen Victoria's wedding dress project, at a wage of £3 per week, roughly 3 times what you earned from your regular clients. With room and board provided in palace servants' quarters, you would begin immediately. You would sign a confidentiality agreement. You would not discuss your work with anyone outside the project team, on penalty of legal prosecution and permanent blacklisting from respectable society. You signed without hesitation, though your hands shook slightly as you wrote your name. Do you remember that feeling, the vertigo-inducing mixture of pride and terror, knowing you'd been chosen for something that would define the rest of your career? One way or another, the first day in the palace workshop, you met your fellow seamstresses properly. 12 women ranging in age from 23 to 57, representing different specialties and regional traditions. Margaret Thornbury, at 41, had the most experience with aristocratic commissions. Elizabeth Chen brought her hybrid technique that would prove invaluable for the most intricate pearl patterns. Young Anne Morrison, barely 23, had eyes so sharp she could thread a needle in near darkness and spot colour discrepancies no one else noticed. Sarah Blackwood served as the team's unofficial quality inspector, possessed of such exacting standards that even Mrs. Bettinson occasionally deferred to her judgment. Mrs. Bettinson established the rules immediately. You would work 6 days per week, from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, with a half-hour break for lunch and 2 10-minute rest periods to prevent eye strain. Sundays were your own, though you were still bound by confidentiality agreements and expected to remain on palace grounds. No visitors. No correspondence that wasn't reviewed by palace officials first. Yes, they actually read your letters home, redacting any details about your work with thick black ink. No discussing the dress's design with anyone, even other palace servants. No sketching or note-taking that could later be used to recreate proprietary techniques. The workshop itself was a converted morning room on the palace's 3rd floor, chosen because its northern-facing windows provided the most consistent natural light crucial for colour matching. Heavy curtains could be drawn at night, when you worked by candlelight carefully positioned to minimise shadows and eye strain. The room contained 12 individual workstations, each with its own adjustable chair, embroidery frame, and wooden case containing threads organised by weight and colour. A central table held the communal supply scissors of various sizes, measuring tapes, thimbles in different sizes, pins, needles sorted by gauge, and most importantly, the locked cabinets containing the pearls. Only Mrs. Bettinson and her assistant, a hawk-eyed woman named Mrs. Davies, had keys to those cabinets. Every morning, they would distribute pearls to each seamstress based on that day's assigned tasks, perhaps 200 pearls for working on lace appliques, or 50 larger ones for a section of the bodice. Every evening, you had to account for each pearl. Used ones could be shown stitched onto the fabric. Unused ones had to be returned to Mrs. Davies, who would count them twice before locking them away. If a pearl broke during attachment, it happened. Despite everyone's best efforts, natural pearls have microscopic stress fractures that can cause them to crack under thread tension. You had to present the pieces as evidence and document exactly what went wrong in a logbook that Mrs. Bettinson reviewed weekly. Historians still argue whether this level of security was necessary or simply reflected the Victorian obsession with accounting and control. But consider this: a single high-quality seed pearl in 1840 cost approximately what a housemaid earned in a day. The 6,000 pearls on Victoria's dress represented roughly 16 years of a working-class woman's wages, all stitched onto a garment that would be worn once. The paranoia about theft wasn't entirely unreasonable, especially given that desperate seamstresses in less reputable establishments had been known to substitute cheap glass beads for genuine pearls, pocketing the difference. You quickly learned that technical skill was only part of what made someone successful in this environment. Psychological resilience mattered just as much. The monotony of attaching pearl after pearl, flower after flower, could drive some women to distraction. Anne Morrison lasted only 3 weeks before she started having panic attacks, hyperventilating whenever Mrs. Bettinson approached her workstation. She was thanked for her service, paid generously, made to sign additional confidentiality papers, and escorted off palace grounds by 2 footmen who ensured she didn't speak to anyone on her way out. Her replacement, Catherine Webb, arrived the next day and integrated into the team as if Anne had never existed. No one spoke about it. That was the unspoken rule. You kept your head down, did your work, and didn't ask questions about anything that wasn't directly related to sewing. But here's something that might surprise you despite the pressure and the surveillance and the absolutely suffocating expectations. You found yourself happier than you'd been in years. There's something profoundly satisfying about being surrounded by women who understand excellence the way you do, who don't need to have perfection explained because they feel it in their bones the same way you do. When Margaret Thornbury solved a particularly tricky problem with puckering fabric by suggesting a backing of silk paper, everyone in the room understood the elegance of her solution immediately. When you discovered a method for securing pearls to delicate lace edges without visible stitches, Elizabeth Chen literally applauded. You were part of something larger than yourself, creating something that would outlive all of you. That knowledge made the aching fingers and the eye strain and the isolation almost bearable. Almost. The pearls resting in their velvet-lined boxes before you have travelled farther than most people in Victorian England will journey in their entire lifetimes. Each luminous sphere carries with it a story of danger, exploitation, and the brutal economics of luxury goods that polite society prefers not to examine too closely. You pick up a particularly beautiful specimen, perfectly round, with that subtle pink undertone that makes it ideal for the dress's most visible sections, and you wonder, just for a moment, whose hands pulled the oyster from which it came. You'll never know the answer, of course. That's not how supply chains work in 1840, especially supply chains built on the broken backs of colonised peoples. The majority of the pearls you're working with originated in the waters off Ceylon, known today as Sri Lanka, where pearl diving has been practiced for over 2,000 years. The banks off the northwestern coast, particularly near the island of Manor, produce some of the world's finest natural pearls, and the British East India Company controls the trade with an iron fist wrapped in the velvet glove of civilizing mission rhetoric. Each year, during the diving season between February and April, thousands of Tamil and Moorish divers converge on makeshift camps along the coast, ready to risk their lives for wages that barely cover their basic survival. Picture the scene before dawn. Hundreds of small boats called donis push off from shore, each carrying a crew of 10 to 12 men. The divers themselves are often barely more than boys, chosen young because their smaller bodies require less oxygen and can slip through underwater rock formations more easily. They dive naked except for a loincloth, their only equipment a weighted stone tied to the rope to help them descend quickly, a basket woven from coconut palm to collect oysters, and occasionally a clip pinching their nostrils shut. No breathing apparatus. No goggles, the salt water burns their eyes, but they've learned to see through the sting. No protection from jellyfish, whose tentacles leave welts that become infected in the tropical heat, or from sharks that cruise these waters looking for easy prey. A diver takes several deep breaths, hyperventilating to saturate his blood with oxygen, then grabs the stone and drops over the side. The descent takes only seconds, the weight pulling him 60, sometimes 80 feet down to where oyster beds carpet the ocean floor. His lungs are already burning as he releases the stone and begins frantically prying oysters from the rocks, stuffing them into his basket with hands that have been cut so many times by sharp shells that the scar tissue has formed permanent calluses. He has perhaps 90 seconds, 2 minutes if he's exceptionally skilled before his oxygen runs out and he must signal to be pulled up. The crew hauls on the rope, dragging him back to the surface where he breaches like a dolphin, gasping and coughing, sometimes spitting blood from the pressure damage to his lungs. Then he does it again, and again, 40, sometimes 50 times per day, day after day, for the entire 3-month season. The physical toll is catastrophic chronic ear infections that leave many divers partially deaf by their 30s, lung damage that causes them to cough up blood for years afterward, joint problems from the repeated pressure changes, and a life expectancy that rarely extends past 45. Do you know what the survival rate is for these divers? Roughly 1 in 15 doesn't make it through a single season, killed by drowning, shark attack, or simply the cumulative damage of pushing the human body beyond its limits day after day. And here's the truly devastating part of the thousands upon thousands of oysters harvested. Only a tiny fraction contain pearls at all. Most oysters are empty, their deaths pointless. Of those that do contain pearls, the majority produce specimens too irregular, too discoloured, or too small to be commercially valuable. Perhaps one oyster in 3,000 yields a pearl fine enough to be considered for royal work. The divers are paid by the boatload of oysters collected, not by pearls found, which means they have no financial stake in the quality of their catch. They dive, they risk death, they destroy their bodies, and they earn just enough to feed their families until the next season, when the cycle begins again. From Ceylon. The oysters are transported to shore where they're left in the sun to rot because that's the most efficient way to extract the pearls. Imagine the smell, thousands of decomposing mollusks baking in tropical heat, attracting clouds of flies while workers sort through the putrid flesh with their bare hands, searching for those occasional gleaming treasures. The pearls are washed, sorted by size and quality, then sold to middlemen who sell to traders who sell to exporters who eventually sell to dealers in London, each layer adding markup until a pearl that earned its diver perhaps a day's wages costs a royal household enough to feed a family for a month. The Persian Gulf provides another significant source of the pearls you're stitching, and conditions there are, if anything, even more brutal. Arab divers working the banks off Bahrain and Qatar face the same risks as their Ceylonese counterparts. With the added challenge of working in waters where summer temperatures can reach 110 degrees Fahrenheit, the heat is so intense that oysters brought to the surface too quickly can literally cook in their shells before reaching the boat. Here, too, the economics are exploitative. Most divers work under a system called diving debt, where boat captains advance them money at the beginning of the season, then keep them in perpetual obligation through creative accounting and inflated prices for food and equipment. There are darker stories too, whispered tales that respectable merchants dismiss as exaggerations, but that contain more truth than anyone wants to acknowledge. Stories of divers who protested inadequate pay being blacklisted from all legitimate boats, forcing them to work for criminal operations that pushed them even harder and paid even less. Stories of boys as young as 10 being pressed into service when their fathers died, inheriting debts they could never repay. Stories of bodies washing ashore, and no one bothering to identify them or inform their families because labour was cheap and replaceable. You don't think about these things while you work. Of course. How could you, if you allowed yourself to truly contemplate the human cost of each pearl passing through your fingers? The weight of that knowledge would make it impossible to continue. So you do what people throughout history have always done when confronted with uncomfortable truths about the products they consume. You mentally separate the object from its origins. The pearl becomes just a pearl, beautiful and innocent, stripped of its context. This psychological compartmentalization is how empires function, how exploitation persists not through active cruelty but through willful ignorance, wrapped in layers of distance and intermediaries. Historians still argue whether Queen Victoria herself knew or cared about the conditions under which her pearls are harvested. Some scholars point to her later support for modest labour reforms as evidence of a social conscience. Others note that she continued purchasing pearls throughout her long reign, suggesting that whatever qualms she might have had were insufficient to change her behaviour. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. She likely knew in a vague, abstract way that pearl diving was dangerous work, but never investigated the specifics closely enough to be forced to confront the full reality. That's the privilege of being at the top of an empire. You can remain ignorant, as long as you don't ask inconvenient questions. There were alternatives, of course, though not ones that could provide the quantity and quality required for royal projects. Some pearls came from freshwater sources, rivers in Scotland and Wales, where mussels occasionally produced lustrous specimens. But freshwater pearls were generally smaller and less spherical than their saltwater cousins, suitable for lower-tier aristocratic jewellery, but not for a queen's wedding dress. There were also pearls from the waters off Japan, harvested by amas de verre, predominantly women who dove with remarkable skill, but trade with Japan in 1840 was limited, and the pearls that did reach European markets were immediately snapped up by the highest bidders. So the royal household, whether consciously or not, made the same choice that wealthy consumers have always made. They prioritise quality and availability over ethical sourcing. The pearls came from wherever they could be obtained in sufficient quantities at acceptable prices. And if the human cost was high, well, that was simply the price of luxury. This calculus hasn't changed as much as we'd like to believe modern supply chains for electronics. Clothing and countless other goods operate on similar principles, just with more intermediaries to obscure the connections between consumers and the people whose labour makes consumption possible. You finish another orange blossom, this one using 14 pearls that probably represent at least 2 full days of diving. 2 divers risking their lives repeatedly. and 30 or 40 dead oysters. The blossom is exquisite. The pearls catch the afternoon light streaming through the workshop windows, creating soft shadows that make the flat lace suddenly seem dimensional, alive. Mrs. Bettinson inspects your work, nods her approval, and moves on to examine Catherine Webb's progress on a spray of roses. You allow yourself a moment of pride before reaching for the next set of pearls, pushing away any thoughts about their origins. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that you, and everyone else in this room, has tacitly accepted creating beauty sometimes requires ignoring ugliness. Not always. There are crafts and arts built on ethical foundations, but in the world of royal luxury in 1840, that separation was not just common but necessary. The entire system depended on it. And while future generations might judge you harshly for your participation, you're living in the moment, doing what you know how to do, creating something that will be remembered long after the circumstances of its creation are forgotten. The pearls keep coming, box after box, week after week. You stop wondering about their origins. It's easier that way. The workshop where you spend your days exists in a state of enforced secrecy that feels almost absurd until you remember what century you're living in. This is 1840, an era when industrial espionage is rampant, when French fashion houses would pay handsomely for sketches of English designs, when a rival nation learning the details of a royal wedding dress months before the ceremony could commission something grander and steal the spotlight. So the precautions, while excessive by modern standards, make a certain paranoid sense within the context of international competition and royal prestige. The room itself is located in a section of Buckingham Palace that most servants never visit, accessed through a series of corridors that require passing 3 separate guard posts. The guards don't wear the ceremonial uniforms you see at palace gates. These are plainclothes security men, former military officers chosen for their discretion and their ability to remember faces. They know the 12 seamstresses by sight, along with Mrs. Bettinson, Mrs. Davies, and the handful of palace officials authorised to check on the project's progress. Everyone else, from the Lord Chamberlain's secretary to visiting foreign dignitaries, is politely but firmly turned away at the first checkpoint with vague explanations about private household matters. The workshop's windows, those north-facing sources of precious natural light, are covered with semi-transparent curtains that allow illumination while preventing anyone outside from seeing in. Not that there's much risk of spies with telescopes. The windows overlook an interior courtyard used exclusively by upper household staff, but Mrs. Bettinson insists on the curtains anyway. She's fought too hard to maintain absolute control over information flow to risk some enterprising footman catching a glimpse of the dress and selling a description to the Morning Post for a few shillings. Every evening before you're dismissed, Mrs. Davies conducts an inspection that would make a military quartermaster proud. She counts the returned pearls twice, as you know, but that's just the beginning. She also examines the dress itself, which rests on a specially constructed adjustable mannequin that approximates Victoria's measurements, looking for any sections that might have been sketched or traced. She checks the waste bins for fabric scraps that might reveal construction techniques. She even inspects your hands and the cuffs of your sleeves, searching for pearl dust or thread fibres that could theoretically be analysed by a competitor to determine what materials you're using. This last precaution strikes you as particularly excessive. Who has the technology or inclination to analyse thread fibres scraped from someone's sleeve? But you comply without complaint because complaining about security protocols is an excellent way to end up unemployed and possibly under investigation for suspicious behaviour. So you hold out your hands like a schoolchild being checked for ink stains, and you let Mrs. Davies examine your cuffs. and you tell yourself that the generous wages make up for the indignity of being treated like a potential criminal despite having done nothing wrong. The confidentiality agreements you signed were not simple one-page documents. They were dense legal contracts, 7 pages of tiny print in the impenetrable language that solicitors use to ensure no one can claim they misunderstood the terms. The core requirements were clear enough. You would not discuss the dress's design with anyone. You would not sketch or describe it in correspondence. You would not gossip about your work in any public space where you might be overheard. And you would not, under any circumstances, attempt to recreate elements of the royal design for private clients after the project concluded. Violation of these terms would result in immediate dismissal, forfeiture of all wages earned, legal prosecution for breach of contract, and most frighteningly potential charges under laws protecting royal interests, which could theoretically result in prison sentences. Did anyone actually expect these contracts to be fully enforceable? Probably not. Victorian courts were notoriously inconsistent about honouring contracts with women who had limited legal standing, but the contracts served their real purpose regardless. They scared you into compliance. The threat of legal action, even if unlikely to materialise, was enough to ensure that you thought twice before saying anything indiscreet at church on Sunday or in letters to your sister in Manchester. The psychological impact of working in this sealed environment is more significant than you anticipated. After the first month, you start having dreams about the workshop, not nightmares exactly, but unsettling scenarios where you're stitching pearls onto an endless dress that keeps growing no matter how much you complete, or wear misses. Bettinson's face looms enormous over your shoulder while she whispers criticisms in a voice that echoes impossibly loud. Some of the other seamstresses report similar dreams. Margaret Thornbury mentions, during one of the brief lunch breaks, that she dreamed she'd accidentally sewn her own fingers to the lace and couldn't pull free. Everyone laughs nervously, recognising the anxiety underlying the absurd imagery. The isolation compounds the pressure. In your normal work life, you could at least discuss your projects with family members or trusted friends, sharing the satisfaction of solving a difficult technical problem or venting frustration about demanding clients. Here, you can't tell anyone anything. Your letters home are masterpieces of evasion. I'm working on an important project for a significant household is about as specific as you can be without triggering the palace censor's redaction pen. Your mother writes back asking for details, and you have to reply with more vague non-answers that must make you sound either impossibly snobbish or involved in something scandalous. The rule against visitors means you won't see your family until the project concludes. Your younger brother's wedding happens in March, and you have to miss it, Mrs. Bettinson denies your request for leave with barely a glance, noting that the work schedule has no room for personal absences except in cases of death or life-threatening illness. You write a letter apologising to your brother, enclosing a generous gift bought with your royal wages, and you wonder if he'll ever forgive you for choosing your career over his celebration. Probably he will, eventually, but the sting of missing it, of being absent from a family milestone because 12 seamstresses and their supervisor have collectively decided that a wedding dress is more important than a wedding itself, that sting lingers. Do you remember what you learned about loyalty during those months? Not loyalty to institutions or contracts, but loyalty to the women working beside you, because in the absence of family and friends, your fellow seamstresses become your community by default. You learn that Elizabeth Chen hums softly when she's concentrating, a nearly inaudible melody that sounds like something her mother taught her. You discover that Catherine Webb has the driest sense of humour, capable of making devastating observations about palace protocol without changing her expression at all. You realise that Margaret Thornbury, for all her expertise and seniority, is desperately lonely. Her husband died 3 years ago, and she has no children, and this work is what gives her life structure and meaning. These women become real to you in ways that transcend professional relationships. When Sarah Blackwood receives news that her father is gravely ill, you all pool resources to hire the best physician in London to attend him, and you take turns covering her work when she's too distracted by worry to maintain her usual precision. When young Catherine Webb celebrates her 26th birthday in April, someone, probably Margaret, arranges for a small cake to appear during the lunch break, and you all sing quietly, aware that such frivolity is technically against the rules, but also convinced that Mrs. Bettinson will look the other way for a few minutes of humanity. Mrs. Bettinson herself is more complicated than her stern reputation suggests. Yes, she's demanding and inflexible about quality standards. Yes, she runs the workshop like a military campaign, with schedules and inspections and consequences for failure. But you gradually realise that her strictness serves a protective function by maintaining absolute control over the project, by documenting every decision and accounting for every supply. She shields you from the various palace officials who would love to interfere with the work or claim credit for its success. When an undersecretary from the Lord Chamberlain's office shows up demanding to inspect the dress for a report he's preparing, Mrs. Bettinson blocks him at the door and refuses entry until he produces written authorization from the Queen herself. He can't, so he leaves, and you hear him muttering threats about her exceeding her authority. She doesn't even blink. Historians still argue whether the security measures surrounding royal wedding preparations in the Victorian era were primarily about preventing espionage or about controlling the narrative. Both factors mattered, certainly. But there's also a third element that gets less attention. The security theatre created an aura of mystery and importance that enhanced the dress's eventual impact. When Victoria finally appeared in her gown on February 10th, 1840, much of the public's fascination stemmed from the fact that they were seeing something that had been carefully hidden for months. The secrecy itself became part of the dress's story. Making it more than just a garment, it was a revelation. A carefully orchestrated unveiling that newspapers breathlessly described in language usually reserved for religious experiences. You're participating in the creation of that mystique whether you fully understand it or not. Every hour you spend in this sealed workshop, every pearl you attach under conditions of enforced silence, contributes to building anticipation across Britain and Europe. People know the Queen's wedding dress is being made. They just don't know what it looks like, what innovations it contains, what statement it will make. That gap between knowledge and ignorance is where fascination breeds, and palace officials are expert at maintaining that gap for maximum effect. The absurdity of the situation occasionally strikes you during quiet moments. You're sitting in one of the most powerful buildings in the British Empire, working on a garment for one of the world's most influential women, and you're essentially a prisoner, well compensated and relatively comfortable, but constrained nonetheless. You can't leave the palace grounds without permission. You can't communicate freely with the outside world. You can't even walk past certain corridors without encountering guards who politely redirect you back to authorized areas. The golden cage is still a cage, even if the bars are made of silk thread and pearl nacre instead of iron. But here's what makes it bearable: you believe in the work itself. Not the monarchist symbolism or the nationalist propaganda about British craftsmanship. Those elements leave you largely indifferent. What matters is the technical achievement, the fact that you're solving problems and creating beauty at a level that few people in history ever reach. When you attach a pearl so precisely that it seems to float on the lace, rather than being stitched to it. When you step back and see how the cumulative effect of thousands of small decisions has created something that genuinely shimmers with an inner light, those moments justify the sacrifice. The dress is becoming something extraordinary, and you're part of making that happen. The rest is just noise. Threading a needle with silk fine enough to pass through a pearl's drill hole without damaging the nacre is an art that takes years to master. And even then, your success rate on any given day depends on factors as arbitrary as the humidity level or how much sleep you got the night before. You're working with thread so delicate that it's almost invisible in dim light, and you're trying to guide it through the eye of a needle barely thicker than the human hair. Your fingers need to be steady but not tense, gentle but not hesitant, and you need to do this hundreds of times per day without your hands cramping or your eyes straining to the point where you can no longer see what you're doing. The needles themselves are specially made by a craftsman in Sheffield who supplies the royal household exclusively. They're not the standard sewing needles you'd find in any draper's shop. Those would be far too coarse for this work. These are ultra-fine beading needles, forged from the highest quality steel, polished until they're almost frictionless, with eyes so small that you sometimes need to hold them up to a window to confirm you've actually threaded them successfully. Mrs. Bettinson ordered 3,000 needles at the project's start, anticipating that many would break or become too dull for precision work. She wasn't wrong. You go through approximately 15 needles per week, and Margaret Thornbury, who's working on the dress's most intricate sections, breaks at least 20. The thread is Chinese silk, imported at considerable expense because British silk manufacturers, despite Victoria's preference for domestic materials, simply can't produce filaments fine enough for this application. This creates a minor diplomatic awkwardness. Here's a dress meant to showcase British industry, relying on Chinese thread because British mills aren't capable of matching the quality. No one talks about it publicly, of course. The official descriptions of the dress that will eventually appear in newspapers will mention the finest silk thread without specifying its origin, allowing readers to assume it's British unless they know enough about textile manufacturing to recognise the impossibility. Now comes the truly delicate part, the pearls themselves. Each one has been pre-drilled, a process that you're grateful not to have witnessed because even hearing about it makes you anxious. Drilling a natural pearl without cracking it requires a level of precision that borders on the supernatural. The drill bit of fine wire tipped with diamond dust must enter and exit the pearl at exactly the right angle, applying consistent pressure throughout. Too much force, and the pearl shatters. Too little and the drill wanders, creating an off-center hole that will cause the pearl to hang crooked when stitched. The hole needs to be large enough to accommodate your ultrafine silk thread, but not so large that it weakens the pearl's structural integrity or is visible from the exterior. You've been told that roughly 1 pearl in 20 cracks during the drilling process, even with expert craftsmen performing the work. This means that to obtain the 6,000 drilled pearls currently in Mrs. Bettinson's locked cabinets, approximately 7,500 were originally selected from the much larger pool of raw pearls, and 1,500 of those were destroyed during preparation. When you factor in the thousands of oysters that had to die to produce those 7,500 pearls in the first place, you're looking at a cascade of destruction and waste that would be genuinely horrifying if you allowed yourself to think about it too carefully. So you don't. You focus on the pearl in front of you, the one that survived all those previous culling stages and now depends on your skill to reach its final purpose. The attachment technique you use is more complex than simply running a thread through the pearl and stitching it to the fabric. That method would be visible from the dress's exterior, creating tiny puckers and distortions in the lace that would be unacceptable in royal work. Instead, you employ a 3-stage process that takes approximately 4 minutes per pearl when you're working efficiently, longer when fatigue or difficult placement slows you down. First, you prepare the attachment point by creating a tiny reinforcement patch on the lace's underside. This patch is made from silk organza so fine it's nearly transparent, cut into a square roughly 3 mm on each side. You stitch this patch to the lace using microscopic stitches that follow the lace's existing pattern, effectively creating a small area of doubled fabric that can better support the pearl's weight without tearing. This step is crucial because the Honiton lace Victoria has chosen, while exquisite, is remarkably delicate. It's all threads and air. With minimal structural density, attaching pearls directly to it would eventually cause the lace to tear under the accumulated weight. Second, you position the pearl exactly where the design specifies it should sit. The pattern you're following has been drawn on thin paper and basted loosely to the lace as a guide, with each pearl's location marked by a tiny pencil dot. You hold the pearl in place with your left hand or right, if you're one of the 2 left-handed seamstresses in the group, while your other hand brings the threaded needle up from the lace's underside, through the organza reinforcement, through the pearl's drill hole, and back down through another point on the reinforcement patch. This creates a single stitch that passes through the pearl, holding it in position. But one stitch isn't enough. A pearl attached with a single thread can rotate, shift position over time, or pull free if any stresses apply to the dress. So comes the 3rd stage, securing the pearl with multiple additional stitches, each one passing through the drill hole at a slightly different angle, distributing the tension evenly around the pearl's circumference. You typically use 4 to 6 stitches per pearl, depending on its size and the stress you anticipate that particular area of the dress will experience. The bodice pearls, which will stretch slightly with Victoria's breathing and movement, require 6 secure stitches each. The train pearls, which will mostly lie flat and stationary, can make do with 4. The trick, and this is where years of experience separate competent seamstresses from masters, is making each stitch tight enough to hold the pearl firmly while keeping the thread hidden within the lace's pattern. You have to follow the lace's existing structure, weaving your stitches through its loops and curves so they become invisible, camouflaged within the design's deliberate intricacy. Done correctly, the pearl appears to float on the lace's surface with no visible means of attachment. Done incorrectly, the thread shows as tiny lines radiating from the pearl, or the stitches create puckers that distort the lace's pattern, or the pearl sits at a slight angle that catches light wrong and breaks the visual harmony. Do you feel the concentration required because you can't let your mind wander? Not even for a moment. If you're thinking about the letter you need to write to your mother, or wondering what's being served for dinner, or replaying an awkward conversation with Catherine Webb from yesterday, your hands lose that essential connection between brain and muscle memory, and suddenly you've pulled a stitch too tight, creating a pucker and misses. Bettinson is standing behind you, asking in that terrifyingly calm voice whether you need to take a break because your work seems careless today. The physical toll accumulates gradually. The first week, your fingers ache but you assume you'll adjust. The second week, you develop a permanent callus on your right index finger where the needle pushes through. By the 3rd week, your eyes burn by mid-afternoon despite the excellent natural light, and you start experiencing headaches that persist even after you've stopped working. Margaret Thornbury, who's been doing this kind of precision work for 2 decades, confides that she's nearly 42 years old and her vision is already failing. She needs stronger and stronger light to see what she's working on, and she knows that within 5 years she'll probably have to retire from beading work entirely and focus on coarser applications like embroidery or applique that don't require quite such perfect eyesight. This is the price of mastery in the luxury trades. You literally destroy your body in service to creating beauty for people wealthy enough to afford it. Your hands, your eyes, your shoulders hunched over frames for hours upon hours, all of it gradually deteriorates, and there's no compensation beyond your wages, no pension waiting when you can no longer perform the work, no recognition that you've sacrificed your physical well-being to create objects that will be admired for generations. The pearls you're attaching today will still be photographed and studied in 200 years, long after you're dead and forgotten, and the people admiring them will have no idea what it cost you to put them there. Historians still argue whether the Victorian emphasis on craftsmanship represented a golden age of artisanal skill, or simply exploited workers who had no other options for earning decent wages. The truth, as usual, is complicated. Yes, you're being exploited, your labour creates value far exceeding what you're paid, and the physical damage you're incurring has no price tag attached, but you also take genuine pride in your work. Feel authentic satisfaction when a particularly difficult pearl placement turns out perfectly, and would probably continue doing this even if you won a substantial inheritance and had other options. The joy of mastering something genuinely difficult is its own reward, even when the system extracting that mastery is fundamentally unjust. You finish another section, a cluster of roses, each one requiring between 11 and 15 pearls, arranged in concentric spirals that create the illusion of depth and dimension. You hold it up to the window light, watching how the pearls catch and reflect illumination at slightly different angles because of their minor size variations. The effect is stunning. The flat lace suddenly seems three-dimensional, the roses appearing to bloom outward from the fabric as if they're growing in real time. This is why you tolerate the pain and the eye strain and the isolation, because sometimes, just sometimes, you create something so beautiful that it justifies everything else. Mrs. Bettinson inspects your work, and for just a moment, you see her face soften with something like wonder. Then her professional mask snaps back into place, and she nods curtly before moving to examine Elizabeth Chen's progress. But you saw it, that flicker of recognition that what you're creating together is genuinely extraordinary. It's enough to carry you through the rest of the afternoon, through the tedious evening pearl count, through another night of dreams about needles and thread and pearls that multiply endlessly no matter how many you attach. Tomorrow you'll start on the spray of orange blossoms that decorates the dress's left shoulder. 43 pearls, arranged in a pattern so intricate that Mrs. Bettinson has given you 5 days to complete it rather than the usual 3. You're already thinking about the approach you'll take, the order in which you'll attach the pearls to ensure the weight distributes evenly, the subtle variations in pearl size you'll use to create the illusion that the blossoms are at slightly different stages of opening. But that's tomorrow's challenge. Tonight, you soak your hands in cool water infused with chamomile, trying to reduce the inflammation in your joints. Your fingers are red and slightly swollen, and when you close your eyes, you still see the ghostly after images of pearls floating in the darkness behind your eyelids. This is what dedication looks like, not glamorous, not comfortable, just the grinding daily reality of pushing your body to its limits in pursuit of something you'll never own but will always, in some small way, belong to. Every single pearl that passes through the workshop is logged with a precision that would make a bank accountant jealous. Mrs. Davies maintains 3 separate ledgers tracking the pearl's journey from locked cabinet to finished dress, and she cross-references these ledgers weekly to ensure the numbers align perfectly. The first ledger records the initial inventory, How many pearls of each size category entered the palace, their approximate total weight, and the dealer who supplied them. The second tracks daily distribution to seamstresses, noting who received how many pearls, for which section of the dress, on what date. The third documents the pearl's final destination stitched onto the dress, broken during attachment with pieces retained as evidence, or returned unused to storage. You're initially baffled by this obsessive documentation until Margaret Thornbury explains the economics driving it. A single seed pearl in 1840 costs approximately sixpence, not a trivial sum when you consider that a housemaid earns roughly £12 per year, meaning each pearl represents about an hour of a working woman's labour. The 6,000 pearls destined for Victoria's dress collectively cost around £150, which is more than a skilled craftsman might earn in 2 years. That's before you factor in the larger pearls being used for the bodice's more prominent decorations, or the ones held in reserve in case replacements are needed. The total pearl budget for the dress exceeds £250, which is enough money to purchase a modest house in a provincial town or support a small family for 5 years. With that much value concentrated in a few locked cabinets, theft becomes a genuine concern. Not theft by the seamstresses necessarily misses. Bettinson has vetted everyone thoroughly, but theft by any of the dozens of palace servants who pass through these corridors daily, or by opportunistic criminals who might bribe a careless guard, or even by financially desperate palace officials who might convince themselves that skimming a few hundred pearls from an inventory of thousands wouldn't be noticed. The meticulous record-keeping serves as both deterrent and detective tool if pearls go missing. The ledgers will reveal exactly when and potentially point toward who had access at that time. The daily pearl count happens every evening at 6 o'clock, a ritual you've come to dread despite understanding its necessity. Misses. Davies calls each seamstress forward individually, and you must present either the completed work showing stitched pearls or the unused pearls you're returning. She counts everything twice, making notations in her ledger with a scratchy quill pen that seems deliberately chosen for its irritating sound. If the numbers don't match what you were issued that morning, you must provide an explanation. I broke one while attaching it. Requires you to produce the broken pieces, which misses. Davies examined skeptically before accepting. I needed fewer than expected because the design element was smaller than anticipated. Triggers questions about why you didn't notice this earlier and return the excess pearls at midday. The worst scenario is when you genuinely can't account for a pearl. It happened to you once. 3 weeks into the project, you were issued 73 pearls in the morning, stitched 68 onto a lace panel, and returned 4, but couldn't find the 73rd. You searched your workstation frantically, checking the floor, your clothing, the fabric scraps in the waste bin. Everywhere a tiny pearl might have rolled or fallen. Nothing, Mrs. Davies's expression went from stern to glacial as she interrogated you about your movements throughout the day. Had anyone else approached your station had you left for any reason? Could the pearl have been caught in your clothing and carried elsewhere? The missing pearl triggered a full workshop search. All 12 seamstresses stopped working while Mrs. Davies and Mrs. Bettinson methodically examined every surface, every corner, every possible hiding place. The room fell silent except for the sound of fabric being lifted, floorboards being checked, chair cushions being removed and inspected. 20 minutes into the search, Elizabeth Chen found the pearl lodged in a crack between 2 floorboards near your station. It had apparently rolled off your work table, bounced at an odd angle, and wedged itself into a gap barely visible to the naked eye. The relief you felt when she held it up was profound, almost dizzying. You'd been imagining scenarios where you were accused of theft, dismissed in disgrace, possibly even prosecuted despite having done nothing wrong. Mrs. Bettinson used the incident as a teaching moment for everyone. Pearls are small, valuable, and easily lost. You must develop systems to prevent loss, keeping unused pearls in a small dish rather than loose on your work surface, counting them periodically throughout the day rather than only at evening inspection, being conscious of their location at all times. The lecture was delivered in her usual calm, matter-of-fact tone, but the underlying message was clear. Another incident like this might not end so fortunately. The psychological impact of working under such constant scrutiny is more exhausting than the physical labour. You develop a paranoid awareness of pearl location that never entirely shuts off, even during breaks or at night. You find yourself counting them compulsively, touching each one to confirm it's where you think it is, triple-checking the contents of your return dish before bringing it to Mrs. Davies. This hypervigilance is probably exactly what Mrs. Bettinson wants workers so anxious about accountability that they police themselves more effectively than any external system could, but recognizing the manipulation doesn't make you less susceptible to it. Do you know what's interesting about the Pearl accounting system? It assumes that theft is the primary risk, when in reality, simple loss through accident is far more common. Pearls roll off tables, they fall through gaps in floorboards, they get swept up with fabric scraps and thrown away before anyone notices. They drop into the folds of your clothing and later fall out in your sleeping quarters, where they're impossible to find against pale stone floors. Natural pearls, being organic objects, can even be damaged by casual contact if you handle them with hands that still carry traces of soap or perfume. The chemicals can dull their luster over time, rendering them unsuitable for prominent placement even if they're technically intact. Yet the accounting system tracks theft with forensic precision while treating accidental loss as evidence of incompetence or negligence. This reveals something about Victorian attitudes toward working women, the assumption that you're fundamentally untrustworthy, that your word about what happened to a missing pearl is suspect unless proven otherwise, that the burden of proof always falls on you rather than the system giving you benefit of the doubt. It's exhausting and insulting, but you endure it because the alternative is unemployment, and skilled seamstress positions that pay this well are rare enough that you can't afford to let pride interfere with pragmatism. The larger pearls used with the bodice's central decorations undergo even more stringent tracking. These pearls, some as large as 5 mm in diameter, which makes them positively enormous by seed. Pearl standards are valuable enough that each one is individually catalogued with a description noting its specific characteristics. Slightly oval pearl, 4.8 mm diameter, rose undertone, minor surface imperfection on southern hemisphere. When Mrs. Davies distributes one of these premium pearls, she makes you sign for it specifically, creating a paper trail that connects you personally to that particular pearl's fate. The pressure of working with something that costs more than you earn in a week. Knowing that breaking it will trigger an investigation and potentially cost you wages to cover the loss makes your hands shake the first few times you stitch one of these beauties. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with accounting and documentation represented efficient management or simply reflected a culture of suspicion toward the working classes. Both interpretations have merit. On one hand, the careful records prevented embezzlement and ensured resources were used as intended. On the other hand, the psychological cost of treating skilled craftswomen as potential criminals undermined morale and created an atmosphere of mutual distrust that likely reduced overall productivity compared to what might have been achieved through a system based on trust and respect. You develop strategies for managing the stress of accountability. Some are practical. You create a small wooden tray with raised edges to prevent pearls from rolling away, and you count your allocation 3 times when you receive it, so you can confidently challenge Mrs. Davies. If her initial count differs from yours, this happened once she'd miscounted by 2, and having your own verified count saved you from being blamed for a discrepancy that wasn't your fault. Other strategies are psychological. You remind yourself that the system isn't personal, that Mrs. Davies' suspicion is directed at everyone equally, that maintaining calm professionalism in the face of distrust is its own form of dignity. The other seamstresses cope differently. Catherine Webb treats the daily counting as a joke, maintaining a running commentary of cheerful sarcasm that makes Mrs. Davies' lips thin with disapproval. 63 pearls returned, all present and accounted for. None eaten or smuggled away in my bodice, though I did consider it, she announces during one evening inspection, drawing nervous giggles from the younger seamstresses. Sarah Blackwood takes the opposite approach, becoming utterly silent and compliant during counts, her face carefully neutral, offering no personality that might be interpreted as disrespectful. Margaret Thornbury has done this long enough that she's achieved a state of zen acceptance. The counting simply is neither good nor bad, just another task to complete before the day ends. You find yourself somewhere between Catherine's defiance and Sarah's submission, responding to Mrs. Davies's questions politely, but without the excessive deference that feels like surrendering your dignity. I was issued 81 pearls this morning, stitched 76 onto the lace panel, and am returning 5. You report in a tone that's professional but not obsequious. The facts speak for themselves. You have nothing to apologise for or explain beyond the basic accounting. Mrs. Davies counts, makes her notation, and dismisses you with a nod. Another day successfully navigated without incident. The irony that you're being treated as potential thieves while creating a dress that will be worn once and then preserved in storage for decades, essentially removing those pearls from circulation forever, doesn't escape you. The pearls you're stitching represent more wealth than you'll accumulate in your lifetime, and they're being attached to a garment that serves primarily symbolic purposes rather than practical ones. Victoria could marry Albert in a dress costing 1/10 as much, and the marriage would be equally valid. But royal weddings aren't about practicality, they're about spectacle, about demonstrating power and wealth, about creating moments that will be remembered and discussed for generations. And spectacle requires sacrifice. The divers who harvested the oysters sacrificed their health and sometimes their lives. The pearl drillers sacrificed hours of painstaking labour with significant material waste. You're sacrificing your eyesight, your hand strength, and several months of isolation from family and normal life. All of this is poured into a dress that will be worn for perhaps 6 hours before being carefully packed away. A material manifestation of empire and industry that's more symbol than substance. But symbols matter. You understand this even as you resent the personal cost of creating them. The dress you're making will communicate messages about British craftsmanship, royal taste, and national identity to audiences across Europe and beyond. Those messages will influence fashion for decades, inspire imitators, and create economic opportunities for English textile workers and designers. Your individual sacrifice is a tiny part of a larger system that, while unjust in many ways, also creates the conditions for art and craft to flourish at the highest levels. You return the last of your pearls to Mrs. Davies, endure the final count of the evening, and are dismissed to the servants' dining hall for dinner. Your hands ache, Your eyes burn, but the lace panel you completed today is exquisite, genuinely stunning, and tomorrow you'll begin on a new section. The pearls will be counted again and again and again, but they'll also, eventually, form patterns of such beauty that the accounting will seem, in retrospect, like a small price to pay for precision. The first fitting is scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late January, 6 weeks into the project and 2 weeks before the wedding. You've been warned that fittings are where theoretical designs collide with physical reality, where all your careful calculations about weight distribution and fabric drape are tested against an actual human body that moves, breathes, and doesn't conform perfectly to the wooden mannequin you've been working with. Queen Victoria herself will arrive at precisely 10 o'clock, accompanied by her ladies-in-waiting and the palace's head dressmaker, who, despite not being directly involved in your project, maintains nominal authority over all royal wardrobe matters and isn't shy about exercising it. The workshop undergoes a transformation the night before. Mrs. Bettinson orders a thorough cleaning, every surface dusted, every window polished, every scrap of thread and fabric removed from sight. The dress, which normally rests on its adjustable mannequin in the centre of the room, is carefully transferred to a special standing frame positioned near the best light source. 3 full-length mirrors are brought in and arranged to allow Victoria to see herself from multiple angles. A raised platform is constructed for her to stand on during the fitting, and a privacy screen is erected in one corner where she can change. Though you'll later learn she's too practical to bother with such modesty around women who've been handling her undergarments and body measurements for weeks. You're instructed on protocol when Victoria enters. You curtsy and remain silent unless directly addressed. You keep your eyes respectfully lowered, not staring at the floor like a terrified servant, but not making prolonged eye contact either. If she asks you a question, you answer clearly and concisely, without elaborating unless invited to do so. You absolutely do not offer unsolicited opinions about how the dress looks or whether modifications might be needed. Those observations come only from Mrs. Bettinson or the head dressmaker. Essentially, you're to be useful furniture present, functional, but not presuming to have agency or opinions about what happens. Victoria arrives 7 minutes early, which throws Mrs. Bettinson into barely concealed panic because she's still making final adjustments to how the dress hangs on its frame. The Queen sweeps in with an energy that's surprising given her small stature. She's barely 5 feet tall, much shorter than you expected from her portraits, and immediately starts talking. Not to any specific person, but just announcing her thoughts to the room at large. The light in here is excellent. Much better than the chamber they tried to foist on me last time. Is the dress ready? I'm absolutely terrified it won't fit properly and we'll have to start over. And Albert will be so understanding about it, which will make me feel even worse. This chattiness is unexpected. You've been prepared for a distant, formal monarch, not this anxious young woman who seems as nervous about the fitting as you are. Mrs. Bettinson recovers quickly, assuring Victoria that the dress will fit beautifully, and gently guiding her toward the privacy screen where her lady-in-waiting helps her out of her morning dress and into the elaborate undergarments required for the wedding gown, multiple petticoats. A corset laced to exactly the tightness specified by the dressmakers. Special stockings. Everything calibrated to create the silhouette the dress was designed to complement. When Victoria emerges and approaches the dress, you see her expression shift from anxiety to wonder. She reaches out tentatively to touch the lace, her fingers hovering just above the surface as if afraid contact might damage it. "Oh," she says softly, and that single syllable contains such genuine appreciation that you feel your chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Oh, it's beautiful. The pearls, they catch the light exactly as I'd hoped. Mrs. Bettinson and her assistant begin the delicate process of helping Victoria into the dress, which requires careful coordination because the garment is both fragile and heavy, the weight of thousands of pearls making it substantially more cumbersome than a typical gown. The bodice goes on first, and immediately you spot the problem. The dress fits technically, it fits, with all the closures meeting and nothing obviously wrong, but the weight of the pearl-encrusted lace overlay is pulling the neckline down slightly, creating small gaps that weren't apparent on the mannequin. Victoria notices it too, reaching up to adjust the fabric, and misses. Bettinson's face goes very still in that particular way that signals she's thinking rapidly about solutions. The weight distribution needs adjustment, Your Majesty, she says smoothly. We'll add internal support ribbons to help the bodice maintain its line. A small matter, easily corrected. But it's not a small matter. Not really. Adding internal support ribbons means partially deconstructing the bodice, installing the ribbons in a way that doesn't show from the exterior or create bulk that distorts the silhouette, and then reassembling everything while ensuring none of the pearls are damaged in the process. You're looking at approximately 8 hours of additional work, compressed into an already tight schedule, and Mrs. Bettinson's calm assurance to Victoria is entirely for the Queen's benefit, because once Victoria leaves, someone is going to be working through the night to implement the fix. The skirt presents a different problem. The train, which extends 12 feet behind Victoria and is covered with elaborate pearl-embroidered flowers, has more weight than the structural lace can properly support. When Victoria takes a few experimental steps, you see the train drag slightly, creating stress on the attachment point where it connects to the main skirt. If left uncorrected, this stress will eventually cause the lace to tear, probably at the worst possible moment, say, halfway down the aisle at the Chapel Royal with hundreds of dignitaries watching. Mrs. Bettinson notices but says nothing during the fitting, making mental notes that she'll discuss with the team after Victoria departs. Do you remember feeling the weight of responsibility settling even heavier as you watched the fitting? Because you'd stitched many of those train pearls yourself, following the design precisely, doing everything correctly according to the specifications you'd been given. But the specifications were based on calculations using the mannequin, which doesn't move or create dynamic stress on fabric the way a walking human does. This is the fundamental challenge of couture work. You can plan and measure and calculate all you want, but until you put the garment on an actual body, you don't know what problems might emerge. Victoria wears the dress for approximately 20 minutes, turning slowly so the dressmakers can examine every seam and drape from multiple angles. She asks questions about the construction. How did you attach the pearls without the stitches showing? And will the lace hold up to prolonged wear? That reveals she's not just a passive client but genuinely interested in the craft. Mrs. Bettinson answers patiently, explaining techniques without condescending, and you see Victoria's respect for the work growing as she understands the complexity involved. Whatever her faults as a monarch or a person, she apparently appreciates skilled labour when she encounters it. Then comes the moment that will haunt you for the next week, as Victoria is turning to examine the dresses back in the mirror arrangement. You hear a small sound, not quite a pop, not quite a tear, but a subtle stress noise from fabric being pushed past its comfort zone. Your heart stops. Mrs. Bettinson's eyes flick to the dress, scanning for damage, and you see her pause almost imperceptibly at the left side seam where the bodice meets the skirt. Later inspection will reveal that 3 stitches have pulled loose. Not enough to create visible damage, but enough to weaken the seam's integrity. This will require repair before the wedding, and the repair will need to be invisible, which means unpicking the surrounding work, fixing the underlying problem, and redoing all the decorative elements in that area. But during the fitting itself, Mrs. Bettinson says nothing. She smiles, assures Victoria that everything looks magnificent, and helps her out of the dress with exquisite care while mentally cataloguing every issue that needs addressing. This is professional grace at its finest, never burdening the client with problems they can't solve, maintaining an aura of calm competence even while planning the frantic work that will happen the moment the client leaves. Victoria departs in excellent spirits, chattering about how Albert will be so pleased, how the dress exceeds her expectations, how grateful she is for everyone's hard work. The moment the door closes behind her, Mrs. Bettinson's mask drops. She walks directly to the dress and examines the side seam, confirming what she suspected. Then she turns to face the assembled seamstresses, her expression neutral but her voice carrying an edge of steel you haven't heard before. "We have problems," she announces. "Multiple problems, and we have 2 weeks to solve all of them." She begins listing issues: the bodice support, the train weight, the pulled seam, plus several smaller concerns about how the sleeves sit and whether the waistline needs adjustment. By the time she finishes, you're looking at approximately 60 additional hours of work beyond what was already scheduled. The room goes very quiet as everyone processes this information. 60 hours across 12 seamstresses over 2 weeks is manageable barely if nothing else goes wrong and no one gets sick and every repair is successful on the first attempt. But the margin for error has essentially evaporated. There's no buffer time left for mistakes or unexpected complications. You're operating on a knife's edge now, where a single significant problem could derail the entire project. Mrs. Bettinson doesn't waste time on dramatics or appeals to patriotic duty. She simply assigns tasks. Margaret Thornbury will lead the bodice restructuring, working with 3 assistants. Sarah Blackwood takes responsibility for engineering a solution to the train weight problem, probably involving the addition of hidden internal supports. You're assigned to the seam repair, along with Elizabeth Chen, because your pearl work is among the most precise, and this repair will require removing and then replacing approximately 40 pearls without damaging the surrounding area. Everyone else gets distributed across the remaining issues, with tasks assigned based on individual strengths and the specific skills each problem requires. Historians still argue whether the fitting disasters that plagued Victorian royal weddings were primarily due to inadequate preparation, or simply reflected the fundamental difficulty of creating complex garments under time pressure without modern tools or techniques. Both factors certainly contributed. But there's also a third element: the Victorian insistence on spectacle over practicality, on creating dresses so elaborate that they pushed the limits of what period technology and human hands could reliably produce. A simpler dress would have had fewer problems, but simpler dresses don't communicate imperial grandeur, don't inspire the awe that Victoria's advisors wanted her wedding to generate. The evening after the fitting, you work until midnight on the seam repair. The area requiring attention is approximately 6 inches long, decorated with a curving vine pattern that uses 43 pearls of varying sizes to create the illusion of depth and movement. You and Elizabeth Chen must carefully remove each pearl without damaging the lace, which means cutting every securing thread individually rather than simply ripping the pearls free. Each pearl is set aside in a numbered dish corresponding to its original position. Because the size variations that create the pattern's visual effect mean you can't just reattach them randomly, they need to go back in exactly the same spots. Once the pearls are removed, you can see the underlying problem. The seam itself was stitched correctly, but the lace's weave runs perpendicular to the stress direction, which means that when Victoria moved, the fabric wanted to stretch in a way the seam couldn't accommodate. The solution involves adding a thin silk ribbon along the seam's interior to take up the stress, essentially creating an internal support that will flex with movement rather than fighting against it. This addition must be invisible from both the exterior and the interior. Victoria's ladies-in-waiting will help her dress, and if they see crude reinforcement work, it will reflect poorly on the workshop's skill. You work by candlelight, your eyes burning with fatigue, your fingers moving more through muscle memory than conscious thought. Elizabeth Chen works beside you in companionable silence, occasionally murmuring observations about thread tension or pearl placement, but mostly just focused on the task. By midnight, you've completed the structural repair and are ready to begin reattaching the pearls. But Mrs. Bettinson orders everyone to bed, insisting that pearl work requires fresh eyes and steady hands that exhaustion compromises. You dream that night about the fitting, except in the dream, when Victoria puts on the dress, it immediately falls apart, pearls cascading to the floor like rain, lace tearing with sounds like screaming, the whole garment dissolving into rags and debris, while Victoria stands there looking disappointed but unsurprised, as if she'd expected you to fail all along. You wake in a cold sweat, your heart pounding, and lie in the darkness reminding yourself that it was just a dream, that the dress is fine, that you caught the problems before they became catastrophic. But the fear lingers, because you're suddenly very aware of how many things can go wrong, how fragile the line is between success and disaster, how completely your reputation and future depend on successfully navigating challenges you didn't create but are now responsible for solving. The dress will be beautiful. It has to be. Because the alternative public failure on a royal wedding day is simply unthinkable. The patterns you're stitching onto Victoria's dress aren't arbitrary decorative choices. They're a carefully constructed visual language that communicates specific messages to anyone educated enough to read the symbols. The orange blossoms scattered across the bodice and train represent fertility and eternal love. A not-so-subtle announcement of Victoria's expectations for her marriage to Albert. The roses interwoven among them symbolise both English national identity and the Tudor dynasty from which Victoria can claim descent. Even the choice of pearl as the primary decorative element carries meaning. Pearls represent purity, wisdom, and the treasures of empire, making them ideal for a young queen positioning herself as both a moral exemplar and the ruler of a global commercial power. Mrs. Bettinson explained some of this symbolism during your first week, though you suspect she herself doesn't grasp the full complexity of what the design encodes. The pattern was created by a court artist working in consultation with Victoria's advisors. People who understand that royal garments function as political documents as much as fashion statements. Every element visible in official wedding portraits will be analysed by foreign courts, discussed in newspapers, and imitated by aristocratic brides across Europe. The dress must therefore communicate the right messages. British craftsmanship is world-class. Victoria's taste is impeccable but not ostentatious. The young queen respects tradition while embracing her role as a modern monarch. But there are also private symbols worked into the design, elements that wouldn't be apparent in official portraits but that Victoria herself would know are present. Hidden among the more prominent floral patterns are tiny forget-me-nots. Albert's favourite flower, placed in locations where only someone wearing the dress would see them. The interior of the sleeves, the underside of a lace panel that falls near her hip. These intimate touches transform the dress from a public spectacle into a personal gift. Victoria's way of literally wearing her affection for Albert, where he might notice it if he happened to look closely during private moments. You're working on one of these hidden forget-me-nots now, stitching pearls so tiny they're almost invisible to create the 5-petaled flower shape. Each petal requires only 3 pearls, but they must be positioned with absolute precision to create the distinctive forget-me-not silhouette. The blue centres created using pearls with a distinctive silvery blue tint that took weeks to source are barely a millimetre across, and attaching them without obscuring their colour requires stitching through only the pearl's edge rather than its centre. It's finicky, frustrating work, and you're sweating despite the room's cool temperature because the pressure of working on something meant to be intimate and personal feels somehow more intense than creating the public-facing elements. Margaret Thornbury, working at the station beside yours, is stitching the family crest elements into the train's central panel. This is even more complex symbolism, encoding Victoria's lineage and her constitutional relationships with various noble houses through a system of heraldic imagery that most modern viewers would find completely inscrutable. The crest includes elements representing the houses of Hanover, Saxe-Coburg, and various other dynastic connections, all rendered in pearls of subtly different sizes and arranged according to rules that Margaret has spent 3 days studying. One wrong pearl placement could inadvertently suggest a political alliance that doesn't exist or slight a family whose support Victoria needs. So Margaret measures and remeasures each element before committing to stitching it. The language of flowers floriography, as Victorian ladies call it, is particularly elaborate in this period, and Victoria is known to be an enthusiast of communicating through botanical symbolism. Do you remember the meanings that various flowers carried? Orange blossoms for chastity and fertility, obviously, roses for love, but different coloured roses carried different nuances: red for passionate love, pink for admiration, white for purity, forget-me-nots for true love and remembrance, ivy for fidelity and eternal life, myrtle for love in marriage, which is why myrtle sprigs were traditionally included in royal bridal bouquets. The dress incorporates all of these, creating a layered text that someone versed in floriography could read like a love letter. The orange blossoms cluster most densely around the neckline and waist, emphasizing femininity and fertility. The roses form the largest visual elements, declaring love prominently. The forget-me-nots hide in intimate places, personal rather than public. And woven throughout, almost invisible unless you're looking for them, are tiny ivy tendrils created with the smallest pearls available, promising fidelity that endures beyond death. But here's where things get more interesting. Some of the symbolism isn't about Victoria and Albert at all, but about Victoria's relationship with her subjects and her role as monarch. The Tudor roses, for instance, invoke Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who ruled England during its emergence as a global power. By incorporating Tudor roses into her wedding dress, Victoria is making a statement about continuity of strong female leadership, positioning herself as Elizabeth's spiritual successor, despite the rather significant difference that Victoria is marrying rather than remaining single. Historians still argue whether this was Victoria's own idea or something her advisors suggested, but either way, the symbolism is deliberate and politically sophisticated. The lace pattern itself, independent of the pearl embellishments, encodes additional meaning. Honiton lace was chosen specifically because it represents English craftsmanship. There are French and Belgian laces that are technically superior, but Victoria's insistence on British materials meant Honiton was the obvious choice. The pattern features botanical elements native to Britain: oak leaves for strength, thistles for Scottish heritage, Victoria's claim to the Scottish throne being an important part of her identity as monarch of the United Kingdom, and shamrocks for Ireland. These nationalist symbols are more subtle than the romantic floriography, but they're definitely present, communicating that Victoria sees herself as representing all of Britain, not just England. You find yourself wondering, as you stitch another microscopic forget-me-not, whether Victoria understands all the layers of meaning being worked into her dress, or whether she just approved a design that her advisors assured her was appropriate. She's 20 years old, well educated by the standards of her class, but not necessarily trained in the minutiae of heraldic symbolism or the political implications of textile choices. It's entirely possible that much of the dress's encoded messaging was created by people other than Victoria, using her wedding as an opportunity to communicate ideas that served broader political purposes beyond the personal celebration of her marriage. The class dynamics of symbolic communication are fascinating when you think about them. The people who can actually read all the symbolism in Victoria's dress, who know enough about heraldry, florography, and artistic tradition to decode the messages are primarily other aristocrats and educated elites. Working class observers might recognise the general beauty and impressiveness of the dress, might understand that orange blossoms mean something related to weddings, but they wouldn't catch the references to Tudor roses or the significance of certain pearl arrangements. So the dress communicates on multiple levels, simultaneously spectacle for the masses, sophisticated political messaging for the elite, and personal intimacy for Victoria and Albert themselves. You're part of creating all three levels despite only really understanding the first. Your technical skill is what makes the symbolism physically manifest, but you don't need to fully comprehend the meaning to execute the work correctly. This is the craftsperson's position throughout history, essential but not necessarily informed about the larger purposes your labour serves. Margaret Thornbury probably understands more than you do because her aristocratic clients have given her context over the years. But even she occasionally consults with Mrs. Bettinson about whether a particular heraldic element is positioned correctly according to the artist's specifications. The irony is that centuries from now, when historians study this dress, they'll know exactly what symbols were included and what they meant according to Victorian cultural codes, but they might not know the names of the women who actually stitched them. You'll be anonymous seamstresses, a collective category rather than individuals with specific skills and perspectives. Your labour will be visible in every photograph and painting of the dress, but your identity will be erased by the same class dynamics that make you essential yet forgettable. Do you feel the weight of that paradox? You're creating something that will outlive you, that will be studied and admired for generations, but your personal contribution will be attributed to the royal household or palace craftspeople, rather than to you specifically. There's a melancholy in that realization, a sense that the thing you're most proud of creating will exist in the world without any connection to your name or story. But there's also something oddly freeing about it. You're working for the sake of the work itself, for the satisfaction of solving difficult technical problems and creating genuine beauty, not for personal recognition or fame. Elizabeth Chen has a different perspective on this. During one lunch break, she mentions that in Chinese artistic traditions, craftspeople often deliberately include small imperfections in their work, a slightly misaligned element, a barely noticeable irregularity, because perfection is considered the domain of gods, and attempting it is hubristic. She's not suggesting you intentionally make mistakes in Victoria's dress, but she notes that Western traditions treat perfection as the goal, the standard against which all work is measured, whereas Eastern traditions sometimes treat acknowledged imperfection as a form of wisdom, a recognition of human limitation. You're not sure you agree, Mrs. Bettinson would certainly reject any philosophy that excused less than flawless execution, but the conversation makes you think about what you're actually trying to achieve. Is the goal truly perfection? Or is it excellence within the constraints of human capability? is a dress that communicates the intended symbolism while showing minor irregularities that only an expert could detect a failure? Or is it a success that acknowledges the realities of working with organic materials and human hands? Historians still argue these questions in the context of Victorian craftsmanship, debating whether the era's obsession with technical perfection represented the pinnacle of artisanal skill, or an unrealistic standard that damaged workers' health and mental well-being in pursuit of an impossible ideal. You don't have answers, but you notice that when you accept the possibility of human limitation, your hands relax slightly, your breathing deepens, and paradoxically, your work quality often improves because you're not paralyzed by anxiety about making mistakes. The forget-me-not is complete. You hold it up to the light, examining your work critically. The 5 petals are symmetrical, the blue centers catch light beautifully, and the overall effect is delicate without being fragile. It's good work, excellent work. Actually, and Albert will probably never notice it unless Victoria specifically points it out, but it's there. A tiny encoded message about remembrance and enduring love, stitched into fabric with pearls that crossed oceans, created by hands that will never be publicly acknowledged. The symbolism is complete, layered and silent, just as intended. The atmosphere in the workshop shifts subtly but unmistakably about 5 weeks into the project. When word arrives that another prestigious dressmaking house has received a commission for Princess Adelaide's trousseau and is boasting to anyone who will listen that their pearl work surpasses anything being done for Victoria's wedding. This is Sarah Blackwood who brings the news, having heard it from a cousin who works in the rival establishment. The comment is delivered casually during a lunch break, but the effect on the room is immediate and electric. 12 seamstresses who've been working in cooperative harmony suddenly look at each other with a new awareness. There are other workshops, other talented needlewomen, and in London's competitive luxury trade, reputation is everything. Mrs. Bettinson's reaction is characteristically restrained but pointed. She says nothing directly about the rival house but begins making comments about how certain establishments cut corners by using inferior pearls or less secure stitching techniques that might look adequate initially but won't withstand time or close inspection. She arranges for 2 additional candlesticks to be brought into the workshop so evening work can proceed with better lighting, a clear signal that she expects you to work longer hours producing even higher quality results. The message is unmistakable. You're not just creating a wedding dress anymore. You're defending the reputation of British royal craftsmanship against challengers who would claim superiority. The rivalry manifests in unexpected ways. Margaret Thornbury, who's generally collaborative and generous with advice, becomes noticeably more protective of her techniques. When young Anne Morrison... No, wait. Anne left weeks ago, didn't she? When Catherine Webb asks Margaret about the method she's using to create particularly stable pearl attachments on curved lace sections. Margaret's explanation is polite but vague, leaving out the crucial details that would allow someone else to replicate the technique. You notice similar behaviour in yourself when Elizabeth Chen admires your work on a complex rose pattern and asks specific questions about your approach. You find yourself editing your explanation, sharing enough to be helpful but not enough to give away your hard-won tricks for managing thread tension on irregular pearl surfaces. This competitiveness isn't entirely about the rival dressmaking house. It's also about position within your own workshop hierarchy. Everyone knows that Mrs. Bettinson is keeping mental notes about who consistently produces the finest work, who handles pressure best, who develops innovative solutions to unexpected problems. When this project concludes, She'll be providing references and recommendations that will influence your ability to secure future commissions, possibly for years. Being known as a seamstress who worked on Queen Victoria's wedding dress is valuable. Being known as the best seamstress who worked on Victoria's dress is exponentially more valuable. Do you feel the tension creeping into your shoulders as you work? The way you're suddenly hyper-aware of what the other seamstresses are doing? You find yourself glancing at Margaret's station more frequently, noting how quickly she's progressing, assessing whether her pearl work is actually superior to yours or just different. When Mrs. Bettinson pauses longer at Sarah Blackwood's station, studying her work with evident approval. You feel an irrational surge of something that might be jealousy, even though Sarah's success doesn't diminish your own accomplishments. The collaborative spirit that characterized the first weeks is fraying, replaced by a subtle current of competition that everyone pretends not to feel, but everyone definitely does. The situation escalates when someone, and you never learn who, though you have suspicions damages another seamstress's work. It's discovered one morning when Catherine Webb arrives to find that the lace panel she'd been working on the previous day has 3 pearls missing. Their securing threads cut rather than accidentally pulled loose. The cuts are clean, deliberate, and the missing pearls are nowhere to be found. Catherine's face goes white when she realises what's happened, because those were premium pearls from Mrs. Davies's special allocation, and their loss will have to be documented and explained. And she'll be the one answering questions about why they disappeared from her workstation overnight. Mrs. Bettinson calls everyone together and delivers a speech about professional conduct that's all the more devastating for being delivered in her usual calm, measured tone. She doesn't accuse anyone specifically, doesn't even explicitly state that she believes the damage was intentional, but she makes it clear that sabotage, if that's what occurred, represents a profound betrayal of trust that will not be tolerated. The workshop has locked doors and limited access, which means if the pearls didn't simply fall off and get swept away by cleaning staff, highly unlikely, given the clean cuts through securing threads. Someone in this room took them. She concludes by noting that she's implementing a new policy each evening. Completed work will be locked in a cabinet to which only she has the key. The inconvenience this creates for everyone is presented as an unfortunate but necessary response to circumstances no one wanted. The atmosphere becomes poisonous after that incident. No one openly accuses anyone else, but suspicions bubble beneath every interaction. Margaret Thornbury, who's been the workshop's unofficial leader, watches everyone with narrowed eyes, clearly working through possibilities. Sarah Blackwood becomes even more silent and withdrawn, speaking only when necessary and keeping her gaze fixed on her own work. You find yourself wondering about Catherine Webb. Were the pearls really stolen? Or did she damage her own work to deflect attention from some mistake she made? The thought is uncharitable and probably wrong, but once it occurs to you, it's hard to dismiss entirely. Historians still argue whether competitive dynamics in Victorian craft guilds and workshops enhanced quality through motivation or degraded it through stress and conflict. There's evidence for both positions. Competition certainly pushes people to exceed their previous best work, to develop innovative techniques, to maintain focus even when fatigued. But it also creates paranoia, damages cooperation, and can lead to the kind of sabotage, real or imagined, that undermines everyone's work and morale. The ideal would be to harness competitive energy while preventing it from curdling into destructive rivalry. But achieving that balance is far easier in theory than practice. The rivalry extends beyond the workshop walls to the broader London dressmaking community. Mrs. Bettinson begins receiving visits from other establishments' representatives, ostensibly making courtesy calls, but actually fishing for information about techniques, suppliers, and the overall approach being taken with Victoria's dress. She handles these inquiries with diplomatic skill, sharing just enough information to seem cooperative while revealing nothing of actual value. You overhear one such conversation when Mrs. Bettinson is speaking with a representative from the house working on Princess Adelaide's trousseau, and it's a masterclass in saying many words that communicate nothing. Oh yes, we're quite pleased with the progress. Using traditional methods, of course, nothing terribly innovative. The pearls are lovely, standard sourcing procedures. Queen Victoria has been most gracious in her feedback. The competitive pressure intensifies as the wedding date approaches. You're all aware that the rival house working on Princess Adelaide's trousseau is on a similar timeline. Adelaide's wedding is scheduled for 3 months after Victoria's, which means they're watching closely to see what Victoria's dress looks like, so they can either imitate successful elements or deliberately choose contrasting approaches to make Adelaide's gown seem more innovative. This is how fashion works at the highest levels: constant observation and response, with each major commission trying to outdo or distinguish itself from what came before. There are rumours, probably exaggerated but persistent nonetheless, about industrial espionage in the luxury trades, stories about rival workshops bribing servants to steal fabric samples or sketch designs, about spies posing as suppliers to gain access to workrooms, about seamstresses being offered substantial sums to switch employers and bring proprietary techniques with them. You don't know how much of this actually happens versus how much is paranoid fantasy. But the fact that people discuss it as if it's commonplace reveals something about the cutthroat nature of high-end dressmaking in Victorian London. Your own feelings about the competition are complicated and contradictory. Part of you thrives on it. You're producing genuinely your best work because you know it's being implicitly compared to others, and the fear of being seen as inadequate pushes you to exceed your previous standards. Another part of you resents how the competition has soured relationships that were becoming genuine friendships. You and Elizabeth Chen used to chat easily during breaks, sharing observations about technique and life in general. Now your conversations are cordial but guarded. Both of you aware that anything you say might be evaluated for competitive advantage or reported to Mrs. Bettinson. The most unexpected aspect of the rivalry is how it makes you protective of the work itself. Not just your own contribution, but the entire dress. When you hear someone disparaging the project, a footman muttering that all this fuss over a dress that will be worn once seems wasteful, or a visiting official implying that French dressmakers could have done better, you feel personally offended and defensive in a way that surprises you. The dress has become yours collectively, something your workshop is creating against real and imagined rivals. And any criticism of it feels like an attack on your shared identity and capability. Mrs. Bettinson, perhaps recognising that the competitive atmosphere has gone too far, makes a small gesture toward rebuilding community. She arranges for a special dinner to be catered one evening, with better food than the usual servants' fare, and even a small allocation of wine. During the meal, she gives a brief speech, acknowledging that the work has been difficult, that tensions have emerged, but that everyone's contribution has been essential and appreciated. It's not quite an apology for the surveillance and suspicion that have characterised recent weeks, but it's an acknowledgement that the human cost of excellence has been high. The dinner helps somewhat. Conversations flow more easily with wine and good food, and for a few hours, the workshop feels less like a battlefield and more like what it was at the beginning, a group of skilled women collaborating on something extraordinary. Catherine Webb tells a story about a disastrous commission early in her career that has everyone laughing, and Margaret Thornbury shares advice about managing hand pain that's genuinely helpful rather than competitively guarded. But when the dinner ends and everyone returns to their sleeping quarters, you notice that the feeling of camaraderie doesn't quite survive the transition back to ordinary reality. Tomorrow you will all be competitors again, fighting for reputation and future opportunities, even if tonight you could pretend otherwise. The rivalry with other workshops, the competition within your own team, the constant pressure to prove yourselves worthy of royal patronage, all of it creates an environment where excellence is demanded, but joy is increasingly scarce. You still feel pride when you complete a particularly difficult pearl arrangement perfectly. Still experience satisfaction when misses. Bettinson approves your work without comment, which is her highest form of praise. But the simple pleasure of craftsmanship for its own sake has been complicated by awareness that everything you create will be compared, evaluated, and ranked against work done by others. The dress is beautiful. Your contribution is skilled, but somehow the competitive context has drained some of the meaning from both facts, replacing intrinsic satisfaction with anxiety about external validation. You return to your station after the dinner, looking at the work remaining to be done, still weeks of pearl attachment, still dozens of design elements to complete, and you realise with a quiet sense of resignation that the rivalry will intensify rather than diminish as the deadline approaches. Everyone will become more protective, more suspicious, more focused on individual achievement rather than collective success. This is perhaps the hidden cost of excellence in competitive environments. The excellence itself might be real, but the experience of creating it becomes progressively more isolating and anxious. The dress will be magnificent. You'll all be exhausted, fractured, and relieved when it's finally done. Both things can be true simultaneously. The announcement arrives on a cold morning in late January, delivered by a palace official whose apologetic demeanour signals that what he's about to say will be complicated and possibly controversial. Queen Victoria's cousin, Princess Sophia, has become engaged to a gentleman of a respectable family but unremarkable title, essentially a love match rather than a strategic dynastic alliance. The wedding is scheduled for April, and naturally, Sophia wishes to be married in a dress that reflects her royal status, while acknowledging her future husband's more modest circumstances. This means fewer pearls, significantly fewer pearls, perhaps a few hundred rather than several thousand, and misses. Bettinson's workshop, having proven its capability with Victoria's dress, is being asked to take on this additional commission. You watch Mrs. Bettinson's face as she processes this information, and you can see the calculations happening behind her carefully neutral expression. On one hand, another royal commission enhances the workshop's reputation and brings additional income. On the other hand, you're already stretched thin completing Victoria's dress with only 2 weeks remaining before the wedding. Taking on Sophia's dress means either working longer hours or dividing the team's attention, both of which risk compromising quality on the primary commission. And there's the additional complication that a dress with fewer pearls, while less labour-intensive in absolute terms, carries its own political messaging that must be handled delicately. The palace official continues explaining, and the situation becomes clearer. Sophia's dress isn't meant to compete with or overshadow Victoria's. Quite the opposite, it's supposed to visually communicate appropriate humility, the recognition that she's marrying beneath her station, and this fact should be acknowledged through relative simplicity. But simple in royal terms is still extraordinarily complex by normal standards. The dress should be beautiful but not spectacular, elegant but not opulent, clearly high quality but not so lavish that it suggests Sophia has forgotten her duty to marry appropriately. Threading this particular needle of symbolic communication will require just as much skill as creating Victoria's deliberately spectacular gown, just deployed toward opposite ends, Mrs. Bettinson accepts the commission, because one does not refuse royal requests without excellent reasons. But she immediately begins reorganizing the workshop's structure and priorities. 4 seamstresses, you among them, are reassigned to Sophia's dress, while the remaining 8 continue with Victoria's increasingly time-sensitive project. This division creates immediate tension because everyone knows that the Victoria dress is the prestigious assignment, the one that will be painted and discussed and remembered. While Sophia's dress is essentially damage control for an inconvenient love match, being assigned to the less important project feels like a demotion, even though Mrs. Bettinson frames it as recognition of your ability to work independently with less supervision. The class implications of the 2 dresses fascinate you, even as you resent the additional workload. Victoria is marrying Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a match that's technically slightly beneath her station as reigning monarch, but still thoroughly within acceptable aristocratic parameters. Her dress can therefore be as lavish as budget and taste permit, communicating wealth and power without controversy. Sophia, however, is marrying Mr. Thomas Elliot, whose family owns successful textile mills, but holds no title beyond ordinary gentleman status. This is scandalous enough that some aristocratic families are declining their wedding invitations, and Sophia's dress must walk the impossible line between honouring her royal blood and acknowledging that she's essentially becoming a wealthy commoner. The pearl allocation for Sophia's dress tells the story in miniature 300 pearls total, compared to Victoria's 6,000. Those 300 must be distributed carefully to create visual interest, without suggesting extravagance. Mrs. Bettinson decides they should cluster around the neckline and cuffs the most visible areas in portrait paintings, while the rest of the dress will rely on exquisite lace and embroidery work for its beauty. This approach communicates refined taste operating within appropriate constraints, which is exactly the message Sophia needs to send to critics who already think she's betraying her class by marrying for love. Do you remember your first thought when you learned about the pearl restriction relief? 300 pearls represents perhaps 30 hours of work spread across 4 seamstresses, compared to the months you've spent on Victoria's thousands. But that relief is quickly complicated by the realization that with fewer pearls, each one becomes more critical. There's no visual redundancy, no ability to hide a slightly imperfect placement among hundreds of others. Each of Sophia's 300 pearls must be positioned absolutely perfectly, because each one will be proportionally more visible and more important to the overall design success. You meet Princess Sophia during the initial fitting consultation, and she's strikingly different from Victoria in both appearance and demeanour, where Victoria is petite and energetic, constantly talking and fidgeting. Sophia is tall and quiet, with a stillness that suggests either profound calm or profound resignation. You can't quite tell which. She examines the proposed dress design with serious attention, asking occasional questions about construction, but mostly just listening as Mrs. Bettinson explains the approach. When the pearl allocation is mentioned, Sophia's mouth tightens briefly before smoothing back into neutrality. 300 is quite sufficient, she says in a tone that makes clear this isn't really her opinion, but rather what she knows she's supposed to say. I wouldn't want anything ostentatious given the circumstances. The circumstances. That phrase does so much work, encompassing Sophia's love for a man her family considers inappropriate, her defiance of expectations about strategic dynastic marriages, her willingness to sacrifice status for personal happiness, and the reality that her wedding will be smaller, less celebrated, and deliberately less lavish than Victoria's because she's chosen love over duty. You find yourself unexpectedly moved by her quiet dignity, the way she refuses to pretend enthusiasm for a constraint that's clearly painful, even as she accepts its necessity. She's 24 years old. old enough to know exactly what she's giving up and young enough to still believe love makes the sacrifice worthwhile. Working on Sophia's dress proves to be unexpectedly challenging in ways that have nothing to do with technical difficulty. The reduced scale means you're more intimately involved with every design element. You're not just executing a section of a larger pattern, but actually making decisions about placement and emphasis that affect the dress's overall appearance. This autonomy is professionally satisfying, but also anxiety-inducing because there's no hiding behind, "I was following specifications if something doesn't work." You're actively collaborating with Mrs. Bettinson on the design rather than simply implementing her vision, which means your artistic judgment is being evaluated alongside your technical skill. The other 3 seamstresses assigned to Sophia's dress are women you know, but haven't worked with extensively. Ruth Morrison, the older sister of Anne, who left the project weeks ago, Jane Fletcher, and Dorothy Hayes. All 3 are skilled, but notably less experienced with royal commissions than the team working on Victoria's dress, which you suspect is intentional misses. Bettinson is keeping her most proven workers on the high-profile project while using Sophia's dress as an opportunity to train her second tier. This makes sense from a business perspective, but feels distinctly like being relegated to the minor leagues despite your years of experience and consistent quality. Ruth Morrison becomes the informal leader of your small sub-team, perhaps because she's the oldest at 48 and has the most experience managing client relationships. She suggests an approach for the pearl work that's clever and strategic rather than distributing the 300 pearls evenly. Cluster them in 3 focal points neckline, right cuff, and the train's terminus, creating visual anchors that draw the eye while leaving large sections of dress relatively unadorned. This concentration creates the impression of more pearls than actually exist while maintaining the appropriate restraint the commission requires. Mrs. Bettinson approves the plan with the first genuine smile you've seen from her in weeks. Historians still argue whether the Victorian practice of visually encoding class status into bridal garments was primarily about maintaining social order or simply reflected practical financial constraints that made lavish displays impossible for non-aristocratic families. Both factors operated simultaneously, of course. But there's also a third element rarely discussed: the psychological impact on women like Sophia, who must publicly perform humility about marriage that's personally meaningful while accepting that her wedding will be deliberately diminished to send messages about appropriate behaviour to other young aristocratic women who might be contemplating similar love matches. The work on Sophia's dress proceeds quickly. 300 pearls attached across 2 weeks feels almost leisurely after the intensity of Victoria's project. You find yourself actually enjoying the work in a way you haven't for weeks, partially because the reduced pressure allows for more creative problem solving, and partially because Sophia herself is a more engaged and appreciative client than Victoria. She visits the workshop twice more during construction, asks thoughtful questions about technique, and genuinely seems interested in understanding how the dress is being made rather than simply approving or rejecting design elements. During one visit, she quietly thanks you personally for your work, meeting your eyes directly in a way that acknowledges your humanity rather than treating you as invisible service labour. It's a small gesture, but after weeks of being effectively furniture in Victoria's presence, it means more than Sophia probably realises. The contrast between the two dresses becomes a topic of gossip among palace servants and London society. You hear whispers delivered by visiting officials or overheard through doors about how some people view Sophia's restrained dress as appropriate humility, while others see it as the palace punishing her for choosing love over dynasty. The progressive-minded Admire her courage in marrying for affection rather than advantage. The traditionalists mutter that she's betraying her class and setting a dangerous precedent for other aristocratic women. And caught in the middle is the actual dress you're creating, which must somehow satisfy both factions while allowing Sophia herself to feel beautiful on her wedding day. You complete your final pearl cluster, the right cuff, where 27 pearls of graduated sizes create a bracelet effect that draws attention to Sophia's hands, and step back to assess the overall result. The dress is beautiful in a completely different way than Victoria's, where Victoria's gown overwhelms with abundance and spectacle. Sophia's succeeds through restraint and precision. Every element is exactly where it should be. Nothing extraneous, nothing missing. It's the difference between a symphony orchestra and a string quartet. One achieves impact through sheer force and complexity, the other through clarity and careful balance. Both are valid artistic approaches. They simply serve different purposes and communicate different messages. When Sophia sees the completed dress, she cries. Not delicate, picturesque tears, but genuine sobbing that suggests months of accumulated stress and sadness, finally finding release. She apologizes repeatedly for her emotional display, which makes everyone in the room uncomfortable because you're not equipped to handle aristocratic vulnerability. But through the tears, she manages to convey that the dress is exactly what she wanted, that it makes her feel both royal and appropriately humble, that it honours both her heritage and her choice. Mrs. Bettinson, showing unexpected gentleness, assures her that the dress will be perfect for her wedding, that Mr. Elliot will be honoured to see her in it, that sometimes the most meaningful beauty is the kind that doesn't announce itself too loudly. After Sophia leaves, Mrs. Bettinson gathers your small sub-team and does something unprecedented. She thanks you, not perfunctorily or as empty courtesy, but genuinely, acknowledging that you handled a politically sensitive commission with skill and discretion that reflected well on the entire workshop. The praise feels good, better than you expected, given that you've been resenting this assignment as secondary to Victoria's dress. Perhaps there's value in being part of something smaller and more intimate, where your individual contribution is more visible and the human stakes feel more immediate and personal. The next day, you rejoin the main team working on Victoria's dress for the final push toward completion. The contrast is jarring from Sophia's quiet dignity to Victoria's grand spectacle, from 300 carefully placed pearls to thousands creating overwhelming visual impact, from intimate collaboration to hierarchical execution of predetermined plans. Both dresses will be beautiful, both will serve their purposes. But you find yourself thinking, as you return to stitching Victoria's endless orange blossoms, that sometimes the dress designed to whisper can say more than the one intended to shout. The wedding day finally arrives, and your role transitions from creator to anxious observer as Victoria's dress leaves the workshop for the final time. Carefully transported to the palace's bridal suite where her ladies-in-waiting will help her into it. You and the other seamstresses aren't invited to the actual ceremony, that privilege is reserved for aristocracy and high-ranking officials, but Mrs. Bettinson has arranged for you to observe from a discreet location where you can at least glimpse Victoria as she processes to the chapel. The hours between delivering the dress and potentially seeing it worn feel interminable. Filled with worst-case scenarios, your exhausted mind conjures pearls falling off during the ceremony, seams splitting under stress, some catastrophic structural failure that will immortalize your workshop's incompetence in paintings and newspaper accounts for posterity. But the dress survives its ceremonial debut flawlessly. When you finally catch sight of Victoria processing past your observation point, the relief that floods through you is so intense it's almost painful. The dress looks exactly as it should. The pearls catch candlelight and create that subtle shimmer you'd worked so hard to achieve. The lace holds its shape beautifully despite the stress of movement. The train flows behind her with appropriate weight and grace. She looks radiant, young, and genuinely happy. And for just a moment, all the months of eye strain and hand pain and isolation feel justified because you helped create this moment of beauty that will be remembered for generations. The preservation protocols begin immediately after the ceremony, before Victoria has even finished her wedding breakfast. A team of specialists, not your workshop, but dedicated conservators employed by the palace, takes possession of the dress and begins the delicate process of preparing it for long-term storage. You're invited to observe this process, partially as courtesy and partially because Mrs. Bettinson argues that understanding preservation will inform your future work on garments intended to become heirlooms. What you witness is simultaneously fascinating and slightly horrifying in its acknowledgement that even the most carefully constructed garment is ultimately temporary, fighting a losing battle against time, chemistry, and entropy. The first step is documentation. The conservators photograph the dress from every angle, take detailed measurements, and create written descriptions of its condition immediately post-wedding. They note every visible stress point, every place where fabric shows early signs of wear, every pearl that's even slightly loose. This documentation establishes a baseline against which future deterioration can be measured, creating a historical record that will help conservators centuries from now understand what the dress originally looked like versus what time has done to it. You watch them work with tools you've never seen: specialized measuring devices, magnifying glasses mounted on stands, notebooks filled with technical terminology you don't fully understand, and you realize this is yet another layer of skilled labor that royal garments require. Extending far beyond the initial creation, the cleaning process is counterintuitive. They don't really clean it, not in any thorough way, because aggressive cleaning risks damaging the delicate materials. Instead, they gently brush away loose dirt and debris, use tiny soft tools to clean between pearls and in lace crevices, and accept that some staining and soiling from the wedding day will become permanent parts of the dress's history. The head conservator explains that over-cleaning historical textiles is one of the primary causes of damage in museum collections. Well-meaning efforts to make things look nice end up stripping away original finishes, weakening fibres, and removing evidence of how the garment was actually used. Better to preserve it in slightly soiled condition than to destroy it through aggressive restoration. Do you remember feeling oddly defensive as you watched them handle the dress, noting its flaws and vulnerabilities? You wanted to explain that the slight stress at the left side seam was addressed during fittings, that the minimal puckering near one pearl cluster is actually within acceptable tolerances given the lace's properties, that every small imperfection they're documenting represents a problem you or your colleagues solved as well as could be done given time and material constraints, but they're not criticizing your work, they're simply recording reality, creating the kind of honest assessment that will help preserve the dress for future generations. Still, it feels personal in ways you didn't expect. The storage solution is remarkably sophisticated for 1840. The conservators have prepared a custom wooden chest lined with unbleached muslin, with internal supports designed to hold the dress in a specific configuration that minimizes stress on seams and pearl attachments. The chest itself will be stored in a climate-controlled vault well, climate-controlled by 1840 standards, which means a room below ground where temperature and humidity remain relatively stable year-round, not the precisely regulated environments modern museums would use. The dress is wrapped in additional muslin layers, with tissue paper carefully placed between folds to prevent creasing, and then positioned in the chest with almost ceremonial reverence. But here's what strikes you as profoundly sad: the dress was worn for approximately 6 hours, required thousands of hours of labour to create, and will now spend decades, possibly centuries, in darkness and isolation, never seen by anyone except the occasional conservator checking its condition. The pearls you stitched with such care, each one positioned to catch light perfectly, will sit in perpetual darkness. The lace patterns that look so beautiful in motion will remain motionless. The entire magnificent creation will exist primarily as potential rather than actuality. A garment that could be beautiful if worn but won't be, preserved at the cost of its own purpose. The head conservator, perhaps sensing your melancholy, offers some reassurance future generations will have access to the dress through the documentation and through occasional careful displays when preservation conditions permit. She mentions that someday there might even be technologies that allow people to examine and appreciate historical textiles without risking damage through handling or exposure, though what those technologies might be, she can't imagine. You nod politely, but you're thinking that all the hypothetical future appreciation doesn't change the present reality. The dress is effectively dead, transformed from a living garment into an artifact the moment Victoria removed it. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with preserving royal garments represents admirable historical consciousness, or simply reflects the era's broader anxieties about mortality and legacy. Certainly there's something touching about the care taken to ensure future generations can study these objects, the recognition that material culture matters and deserves preservation. But there's also something deeply melancholic about it. These garments were created to be worn, to move with bodies, to fulfill social and ceremonial purposes. Locking them away forever, even in service of preservation, feels like a kind of death, the object surviving at the cost of its meaning and function. The vault where Victoria's dress will be stored contains dozens of other royal garments, each in its own chest, each carefully labelled and documented. You're given a brief tour, and it's simultaneously impressive and depressing. Generations of royal wedding dresses, christening gowns, coronation robes, all beautifully preserved and completely inactive. The conservator proudly explains the security measures: limited access, regular condition checks, protocols for handling each item, and you understand that these protocols represent genuine expertise and admirable dedication. But you can't shake the image of all these beautiful objects existing in cold darkness. Their beauty theoretical rather than experienced, appreciated only through documentation and memory rather than direct encounter. The preservation expenses are staggering when the conservator mentions them. The custom chest cost more than you earned in the entire 6 months you worked on the dress. The climate-controlled vault requires ongoing maintenance and monitoring. The periodic condition assessments require specialist time and expensive materials over decades. The cost of preserving the dress will exceed what it originally cost to create, which raises interesting questions about priorities and values. Is a dress that no one sees but everyone knows exists valuable? Does the preservation serve genuine historical purposes? Or is it primarily about royal vanity and the aristocratic obsession with legacy? You're not equipped to answer these questions, but you think about them as you watch the chest containing Victoria's dress being carried to its storage location. Somewhere in that sealed wooden box, wrapped in protective layers, are pearls you personally attached, stitches you personally made, problems you personally solved. Those contributions will survive you. The dress will probably exist centuries after your death, but they'll survive without any connection to your identity or story. Future conservators will examine your stitches and make judgments about their quality without knowing your name or understanding the circumstances under which you worked. The anonymity that bothered you months ago now seems almost appropriate. The dress isn't yours and never was. Even though you created it, it belongs to history now, and history is notoriously indifferent to individual craftspeople. The preservation team also addresses an issue you hadn't considered: preventing insect damage. Moths and other textile-eating insects represent a constant threat to stored garments, especially those containing organic materials like silk and wool. The conservators explain their multi-layered defense strategy: regular inspections for signs of infestation, herbs and other natural repellents stored near the garment chests, careful cleaning of the storage vault to remove any organic debris that might attract insects. They mention, almost casually, that some historical garments in the collection have been severely damaged by insects despite best preservation efforts, requiring extensive restoration work that can never fully recover the original appearance. This vulnerability haunts you. You imagine the pearls you so carefully stitch surviving intact, while the lace holding them deteriorates, the silk threads weakening and breaking, moths eating irregular holes through fabric that took months to create. The conservators assure you that Victorian-era preservation techniques are quite good, that most properly stored garments survive for centuries with minimal damage. But most isn't all, and minimal damage still means damage, and you're suddenly aware of how fragile all human creation ultimately is, how everything we make is temporary even when we build it to last. Princess Sophia's dress, you learn, will undergo similar preservation, though with somewhat less elaborate protocols given its lower profile. The dress you worked on more recently, the one that felt more personal and intimate, will also end up in cold storage. Its 300 carefully placed pearls existing in darkness alongside Victoria's thousands. The democracy of preservation both dresses. Despite their vastly different symbolic meanings and material extravagance, will receive essentially the same treatment because both represent royal history worth preserving. In death, if not in life, they achieve a kind of equality. You're allowed to see Victoria's dress one final time before the chest is sealed. The conservators lift back the protective layers, and there it is, still beautiful, still impressive, but somehow already feeling historical rather than contemporary. It's only been a day since Victoria wore it. But the transition from active garment to preserved artifact has fundamentally changed its nature. You notice small details you missed during creation: a pearl that's slightly less lustrous than its neighbours, a section of lace where the pattern doesn't quite align perfectly, minor imperfections that your exhausted eyes overlook during the final weeks of frantic work. Part of you wants to fix these issues, to bring the dress back to the workshop for adjustments and improvements, but that's not how preservation works. The dress is finished, flaws and all, and will remain exactly as it is or as close to that state as conservation can manage for as long as materials and expertise can sustain it. The chest is sealed with a complex locking mechanism that requires 2 different keys, held by 2 different officials, both of whom must be present for the chest to be opened. This security measure prevents unauthorized access while ensuring that future conservators can still examine the dress when necessary. You watch the locks click into place, and it feels oddly final, like attending a funeral for something you created. The dress isn't dead, it still exists, still retains all its material properties, but its life as a functional garment is over. From now on, it exists only as history, as symbol, as carefully preserved evidence of a moment that's already receding into the past. Mrs. Bettinson gathers the workshop team afterward and delivers brief remarks acknowledging everyone's contribution to a successful project. She mentions that you will all receive bonus payments beyond the contracted wages, that references will be provided to anyone who requests them, that the workshop's reputation has been significantly enhanced by this commission. The practical matters of payment and future employment are important, certainly, but they feel almost trivial compared to the strange grief you're experiencing, watching something you poured months of your life into being locked away from light and touch and purpose. Preserved but not alive, remembered but not experienced. You leave the palace that evening for the first time in months, stepping into London's cold February air and feeling oddly disoriented by your freedom. The dress is done. The project is complete. You're unemployed again, though with excellent credentials and sufficient savings to be selective about your next commission. But as you walk through streets that feel both familiar and strange after your isolation, you're thinking about that sealed chest in its climate-controlled vault, about pearls in darkness, about the strange afterlife of objects we create with such care and then must release to whatever preservation or destruction time offers them. The Russian approach to royal weddings makes Victoria's pearl-adorned dress look almost modest by comparison, and when Mrs. Bettinson receives an inquiry from the Romanov court in late 1841 about potentially creating a gown for Grand Duchess Maria Nikolaevna, she spends 3 days just reading the specifications before deciding whether to accept the commission. The letter, written in French by the Grand Duchess's chief attendant and translated for the workshop, specifies that the dress must incorporate no fewer than 10,000 pearls, nearly double what Victoria's gown contained, arranged in patterns depicting orthodox iconography, imperial eagles, and floral motifs specific to Russian symbolism. The timeline is impossibly tight, 18 months from commission to delivery, accounting for the time required to ship materials and the finished garment across Europe to St. Petersburg. You're not directly involved in this project, Mrs. Bettinson ultimately declines the commission, citing capacity constraints and the logistical challenges of working for a foreign court, but the specifications document circulates among London's elite dressmaking establishments, and you get to examine it during a consultation meeting with a potential client. The sheer scale of Russian imperial expectations is staggering and reveals cultural differences in how various European courts understand luxury and display. Where British royal fashion increasingly emphasises restraint and good taste, though still extravagantly expensive by normal standards. Russian aristocracy seems to embrace maximalism as virtue, measuring prestige by the quantity of precious materials incorporated rather than the subtlety of their deployment. The pearl requirements alone would pose extraordinary challenges. 10,000 pearls means approximately 4,000 hours of attachment work if you maintain the 4-minute per pearl average you achieved on Victoria's dress, which translates to roughly 2 years of full-time work for a single seamstress, or 18 months for a team of 6 working simultaneously. But Russian court specifications go further. The pearls must be sorted into 7 distinct size categories and arranged in gradients that create 3-dimensional visual effects, requiring even more time for selection and planning beyond the actual stitching. The head seamstress who'd be managing such a project would need organisational skills bordering on military logistics, coordinating multiple workers across an extended timeline while maintaining quality control that satisfies clients who've probably never accepted anything less than perfection in their entire lives. Margaret Thornbury, who has contacts in European dressmaking circles, shares stories about seamstresses who've worked on Russian imperial commissions. The tales sound almost apocryphal: women who went blind from the close work, workshops where seamstresses literally died at their stations from exhaustion and were immediately replaced by fresh workers, costs so astronomical that a single dress could fund a provincial town's annual budget. You're sceptical of the more extreme claims, recognizing them as the kind of exaggerated gossip that circulates in any profession about its most demanding clients. But even accounting for embellishment, the underlying reality seems clear. Russian imperial weddings represent the absolute apex of luxury textile work, the point where practical constraints give way entirely to symbolic display, regardless of human or material cost. The mortality statistic, when Margaret shares them, are sobering even if only partially accurate. She claims, and again, verification is impossible, that approximately 1 in every 30 seamstresses working on major Russian imperial commissions suffers permanent eye damage severe enough to end their career, and that hand and joint problems are nearly universal among workers who complete these projects. The timeline pressures mean working 12 to 14-hour days under candlelight or early gaslight, both inferior to natural light for detailed work, maintaining precision while fatigued, and pushing the human body beyond sustainable limits because disappointing imperial clients simply isn't an option. The women who survive these commissions with health intact are celebrated as legends in the trade. Their names passed down through generations of seamstresses as examples of almost superhuman skill and endurance. Do you remember wondering, as you listen to these stories, whether the dresses created under such conditions are more beautiful because of the suffering invested in them, or whether the beauty exists entirely independent of the human cost? It's a question you can't answer satisfactorily. The pearls don't know or care whether the hands attaching them are in pain. The finished garment communicates exactly the same messages about wealth and power, regardless of whether its creation was relatively humane or brutally exploitative. Yet something in you resists the idea that suffering and beauty are unrelated, wants to believe that the anguish of creation somehow infuses the object with additional meaning or value. This is probably romantic nonsense. But the alternative, that all your physical discomfort and sacrifice was instrumentally unnecessary, that the same dress could have been created under better conditions, is somehow more disturbing than believing the suffering mattered. The Russian emphasis on pearl quantity over other considerations reflects interesting cultural priorities. In British royal fashion, pearls share attention with lace quality, fabric choice, silhouette innovation, and overall design coherence. The dress is meant to be a total artistic achievement where pearls are one element among many. Russian imperial fashion, at least as described in the specification documents, seems to treat pearls as the primary measure of magnificence, with other elements serving mainly as substrate for pearl display. This difference reveals underlying assumptions about what luxury means and how it should be communicated. British understatement versus Russian opulence. Suggestion versus declaration. Whisper versus shout. Historians still argue whether the Romanov dynasty's extravagant material displays during the 19th century represented confident imperial power or desperate compensation for underlying political instability. Certainly there's something almost frantic about the constant escalation, each Grand Duchess needing more pearls than the last, each ceremony needing to exceed previous spectacles, the entire system spiralling upward in a competition where the stakes are prestige and the currency is human labour and material resources. From a distance of years, knowing what eventually happened to the Romanovs, it's tempting to read these extravagances as symptoms of decadence and decline. But in 1841 the Russian Empire seemed permanent and powerful, and its sartorial excess appeared to be celebration of strength rather than anxiety about weakness. The pearl sourcing for Russian commissions poses challenges even more extreme than what British royal households face. The quantities required exceed what any single supplier can provide, necessitating procurement from multiple sources across Asia and the Middle East. This creates quality control problems because pearls from different regions have subtly different characteristics. Ceylon pearls tend toward pink undertones. Persian Gulf pearls lean silvery. Japanese pearls, when available, show distinctive luster patterns. Mixing pearls from various sources without creating visible inconsistencies requires expertise that few possess, and the financial incentives for suppliers to substitute inferior pearls or even sophisticated imitations are substantial, given the quantities involved and the difficulty of inspecting every individual specimen. There are also rumours, unverifiable but persistent, about the Romanov court maintaining its own pearl cultivation experiments, attempting to create reliable domestic sources that would reduce dependence on foreign suppliers. The biological understanding of pearl formation in 1841 is limited enough that these experiments probably consisted mainly of forcing oysters into stressful conditions and hoping for the best. But the impulse reveals something about the strategic thinking behind material luxury. Dependence on imported goods creates vulnerability that self-sufficient production would eliminate. Whether these experiments ever succeeded or were purely fantastical, you never learn. But the fact that people discuss them as plausible suggests that the scale of Russian pearl consumption was large enough to make domestic production seem worth attempting despite the technical challenges. The seamstresses who do accept Russian commissions, according to Margaret's contacts, are either desperately poor with no better options, or driven by professional ambition to the point of self-destruction. The prestige of completing a Romanov dress is genuinely substantial. It marks you as elite within the already exclusive world of royal dressmaking, opens doors to other aristocratic commissions, and provides lifelong bragging rights. But the physical cost is so high that many women consider it a devil's bargain. Yes, you'll be celebrated and well compensated, but you might also permanently damage your health and sacrifice years of your life to a project that benefits you only through reflected glory from your client's status. The calculation is inherently unequal. The Grand Duchess wears the dress once and moves on with her life, while you carry the physical consequences of creating it until you die. You find yourself grateful, in a complicated way, that Mrs. Bettinson declined the Russian commission. Yes, the money would have been extraordinary. The proposed compensation was roughly triple what you earned on Victoria's dress. And yes, the professional prestige would have been valuable for future career prospects. But you'd already experienced months of eye strain, hand pain and isolation while working on a dress with only 6,000 pearls, doubling that quantity while working for clients even more demanding than British royalty, across language and cultural barriers that would complicate every communication, under timeline pressure that would require even longer hours than you'd already endured. The prospect exhausts you just thinking about it. Perhaps there's wisdom in knowing your limits and refusing commissions that would push beyond them, even when the external rewards are substantial. The fate of Grand Duchess Maria's dress, when you eventually hear about it through the dressmaking gossip network, is both predictable and sad. A French atelier accepted the commission, assembled a team of 20 seamstresses, and worked around the clock for 16 months to complete it on schedule. The dress was apparently magnificent. Newspaper accounts describe it as possibly the most elaborate garment ever created. With pearls so densely arranged they created almost solid surfaces of luminescence, weight so substantial that the Grand Duchess reportedly needed assistance simply standing in it. But 3 of the seamstresses involved suffered permanent eye damage, 2 developed crippling arthritis in their hands, and 1 died 6 months after the project concluded from what was vaguely described as exhaustion and complications. The workshop that created it received substantial payment and international acclaim. The individual seamstresses whose health was sacrificed received standard wages and anonymity. This is the structure you're part of. Whether you want to acknowledge it or not, a system where beauty created through human suffering is celebrated without interrogating the conditions of its creation, where the object is preserved and admired, while the makers are forgotten and discarded once their utility is exhausted. You can tell yourself that British commissions are more humane than Russian ones, that Victoria's dress required sacrifice but not the same extreme cost as Maria's, but the difference is degree rather than kind. You're all British seamstresses and Russian ones. Women working for queens and grand duchesses alike, operating within structures that value what you produce far more than they value your well-being or dignity. The question that haunts you, lying awake at night after hearing about the French seamstresses who paid such high prices for Russian pearls, is whether refusing to participate would make any difference. If you and every other skilled seamstress declined these commissions on principle, would the system change? Or would aristocratic clients simply find less skilled workers willing to accept even worse conditions? Individual resistance feels noble but potentially futile. Collective action would require coordination across international boundaries and craft hierarchies that make unified organisation nearly impossible. So you continue accepting commissions, trying to choose clients who are slightly less exploitative, while acknowledging that you're still participating in a fundamentally unjust system, because the alternative's poverty, different work you're less skilled at, complete withdrawal from your profession seem worse. There's no resolution to these contradictions, no clever solution that would allow you to maintain your craft while escaping the ethical compromises it requires. You're embedded in structures of class and labour and luxury consumption that predate your birth and will continue long after your death. The best you can do, perhaps, is maintain awareness of the costs, refuse the most extreme commissions, treat any seamstresses who work under your supervision with dignity and fairness, and hope that gradually, over generations, the conditions of textile work improve through incremental changes rather than revolutionary transformation. It's not a satisfying answer, but it might be an honest one, acknowledging that you're neither hero nor villain but simply a skilled worker navigating the complicated ethics of labour and survival in an unjust world. The Russian dresses continue being made, regardless of your participation or abstention. Thousands more pearls will be stitched by thousands more hands, creating garments of staggering beauty at staggering human cost. Some seamstresses will go blind, some will die young. Most will simply wear out gradually, their bodies deteriorating under the demands of precision work performed under inadequate conditions. Their stories lost to history while the dresses they created are preserved and studied and admired. This knowledge changes nothing about material reality, but perhaps changes something about how you understand your own work and its place in larger systems of creation and exploitation. The pearls gleam the same regardless of the consciousness behind their attachment, but consciousness matters anyway, even when it doesn't alter outcomes, or at least you tell yourself it matters, because the alternative believing that your awareness is as meaningless as your anonymity is too bleak to accept. The first mechanical pearl setting device appears in London workshops around 1848, roughly 8 years after you completed Victoria's dress, and its arrival sends tremors of anxiety through the community of hand seamstresses who've built careers on skills the machine threatens to render obsolete. The device itself is crude by later standards, essentially a specialized clamp with an automated needle that can attach pearls to pre-positioned fabric with reasonable but not exceptional precision. It's faster than human hands, completing attachments in roughly 90 seconds rather than the 4 minutes you averaged. Though it lacks the nuanced judgment that allows skilled seamstresses to adjust placement based on fabric behavior or design requirements, the machine represents progress, efficiency, and the death of craftsmanship, depending on whose perspective you adopt, Mrs. Bettinson. now running a significantly expanded operation after the prestige of Victoria's dress brought numerous aristocratic commissions, refuses to purchase the device. She delivers a speech to her assembled workers about how certain establishments may chase efficiency at the expense of quality, but her workshop will continue prioritizing human skill and artistic judgment that no machine can replicate. This position is both principled and self-interested, Mrs. Bettinson has built her reputation on handcrafted excellence, and admitting that machines can produce comparable results would undermine the premium pricing her services command. But her resistance also reflects genuine belief that some aspects of craft require human intelligence and cannot be mechanized without significant loss of quality. You want to share her confidence, but you've seen the machine's output, and you're worried. Yes, the attachments are slightly less secure than what you produce by hand. Yes, the machine can't adapt to irregular lace patterns or make aesthetic judgments about subtle placement adjustments. But for many applications, commercial garments, less prestigious commissions, anything where good enough meets the client's standards and budget, the machine is perfectly adequate and dramatically more cost-effective. A workshop owner calculating pure economics can employ one machine operator at modest wages and produce more pearl-adorned garments than 3 skilled seamstresses commanding premium compensation. The mathematics of industrialization favor the machine, regardless of the qualitative arguments for handwork. The broader context is the Industrial Revolution's acceleration through every aspect of textile production. Power looms are replacing hand weavers. Mechanical spinning frames have already devastated traditional spinning professions. And now the final frontier, the detailed finishing work that requires the most skill, is being automated. The pattern is familiar and devastating. Each technological advance promises efficiency and progress while displacing workers whose livelihoods depend on skills the machines make obsolete. Society celebrates the innovation while ignoring or dismissing the human cost, treating displaced workers as necessary casualties of modernization rather than as people deserving consideration and support. Do you remember the fear you felt when you first heard about the pearl setting machines? The visceral terror of becoming irrelevant despite decades spent perfecting your craft. It's not rational. Exactly, royal commissions will still require handwork, and the most prestigious clients will always prefer human craftsmanship over mechanical precision. But the middle tier of the market, where most skilled seamstresses earn their living between the occasional royal commission, is clearly at risk. If machines can produce adequate pearl work at fraction of the cost, why would moderately wealthy clients pay premium prices for hand labour they probably can't distinguish from mechanical output? The invention of imitation pearls poses an even more fundamental threat to the entire ecosystem of pearl-adorned garments. Glass beads coated with essence d'Orient, a substance derived from fish scales that mimics pearl luster, have existed for decades. But 1840s improvements in manufacturing make them nearly indistinguishable from natural pearls except under close inspection. These imitations cost perhaps 1/10 what genuine pearls command, meaning a dress that would require £50 worth of natural pearls can be created with imitations for £5, making pearl-adorned fashion accessible to merchant-class families who could never afford the genuine article. This democratization is arguably positive. Why should only aristocrats enjoy beautiful clothing? But it undermines the exclusivity that makes pearl work economically viable for specialists like yourself. Mrs. Bettinson's response to imitation pearls is uncompromising. Her workshop will never work with them. Period. Any client requesting imitation pearls will be politely declined and referred to less discriminating establishments. This stance is both snobbish and strategically sound. Maintaining absolute quality standards preserves the workshop's reputation with aristocratic clients who can still afford genuine materials and who value the exclusivity that comes from knowing their garments contain real rather than imitated luxury. But it also means turning away business during slower periods, betting that the high-end market will remain robust enough to sustain the workshop without compromising standards for broader commercial appeal. The debate about machines and imitations becomes bitterly personal among London's dressmaking community. Some workshops embrace the new technologies enthusiastically, seeing them as opportunities to expand operations and serve markets previously beyond reach. Others resist adamantly, framing their opposition as defending craft traditions and artistic integrity against the dehumanizing forces of mechanization. The conflict is coded in the language of quality and tradition, but it's really about economics and survival. Who gets to continue earning a living from skilled textile work, and on what terms, in an industry being fundamentally transformed by technological change. Historians still argue whether the Victorian textile industry's mechanization primarily benefited or harmed workers. The traditional narrative emphasizes displacement and suffering, skilled artisans losing livelihoods, wage depression as machines reduced the value of human labor, the alienation of factory work compared to craft production. But revisionist historians note that mechanization also created new jobs operating and maintaining machines, made clothing more affordable for working-class consumers, and eventually, after painful transition periods, led to higher overall living standards. Both perspectives contain truth, and the relative weight you give them probably depends on whether you're evaluating aggregate social welfare or individual human stories of disruption and loss. From your perspective, as someone whose entire identity is bound up in hand skills that machines threaten, the aggregate benefits provide cold comfort. You're 41 years old in 1848, old enough that retraining for different work would be difficult, but not so old that you can simply wait out your remaining working years without adapting. The pearl-setting machines make you anxious, but you're skilled enough that royal and upper aristocratic clients will still require your services. The real victims are younger seamstresses just entering the profession, who'll face a labour market where their carefully acquired skills have diminished value and fewer pathways to establishing sustainable careers. They're being told to learn obsolete crafts that won't support them, or to accept that their labour is worth less because machines can approximate it adequately if not perfectly. Queen Victoria herself inadvertently accelerates the industry's transformation by wearing her wedding dress in widely circulated portraits that inspire imitators across Britain and Europe. Suddenly every bride with social aspirations wants a pearl-adorned white dress like Victoria's, creating demand that far exceeds what hand seamstresses can supply at prices middle-class families can afford. The machines and imitation pearls step into this gap, producing dresses that capture the general aesthetic of Victoria's gown without the craftsmanship or expense. This democratization means Victoria's influence extends far beyond aristocratic circles, making her a fashion icon whose choices shape how millions of ordinary women think about weddings and bridal attire. But it also means that what was exclusive and special becomes common and replicated, losing some of its meaning through mass availability. The palace initially attempts to control this imitation through stern pronouncements about the impropriety of commoners aping royal fashion. But the market doesn't care about aristocratic disapproval. If middle-class brides want pearl-adorned white dresses and workshops are willing to provide them using machines and imitations, the transactions will happen regardless of palace objections. This represents a subtle but significant shift in cultural authority. Fashion is becoming democratized, with market forces and individual choice mattering more than aristocratic gatekeeping. Victoria helped trigger this transformation through the choices she made for her wedding dress. probably without intending or foreseeing the broader consequences. Mrs. Bettinson convenes a workshop meeting in 1849 to discuss strategy for surviving in the changing market. She acknowledges that mechanical competition is real and that the workshop must adapt without compromising quality standards. Her proposal focuses exclusively on the highest end market, accepting only commissions from clients who value hand craftsmanship enough to pay appropriate premiums, while refusing to compete on price with mechanized workshops. This means accepting fewer total commissions but maintaining higher margins on each project, essentially retreating upmarket into the rarefied zone where hand skills still command respect and compensation. It's a viable strategy for Mrs. Bettinson, who has capital reserves and established aristocratic relationships. It's riskier for individual seamstresses who depend on steady employment rather than occasional high-paying projects. Your offered a choice remain with Mrs. Bettinson's workshop under the new model, accepting less frequent work but higher per-project compensation, or seek employment with workshops that have embraced mechanization and can offer steadier work at lower rates. The decision isn't really difficult. You've invested too much in developing elite-level skills to settle for operating machines or accepting wage reductions. But making the choice means acknowledging that your future career will probably involve extended periods without work between major commissions, requiring careful financial management and potentially forcing you to accept the occasional less prestigious project to bridge gaps. The stability you once enjoyed, where your skills virtually guaranteed continuous employment at good wages, is eroding despite your experience and demonstrated excellence. The most painful aspect of these changes is watching younger seamstresses struggle to enter the profession. You remember your own apprenticeship, the years spent learning increasingly complex techniques, the pride of finally being trusted with important work. Now you're seeing talented young women complete similar training only to find that their skills don't translate to sustainable employment, because machines have captured the market segments where they'd normally build experience and reputation. Some adapt by learning machine operation, essentially abandoning craft traditions for industrial work. Others leave the profession entirely, finding employment in unrelated fields where their talents are underutilized, but at least they can earn livings. A few persist in pursuing hand seamstress careers despite diminishing opportunities, driven by passion for the craft or inability to imagine alternative futures for themselves. There are isolated bright spots. Some aristocratic clients, particularly women who've worked with skilled seamstresses and understand the qualitative differences, actively prefer handwork and are willing to pay premiums for it. These clients become increasingly important to workshops like Mrs. Bettinson's, the loyal customer base that justifies continuing traditional methods despite economic pressures toward mechanization. You cultivate relationships with these clients carefully, recognizing that your professional survival depends on their continued patronage and their willingness to value craftsmanship over cost efficiency. It's a precarious position dependent on the aesthetic and ethical judgments of wealthy individuals who could, at any moment, decide that machine work is adequate for their purposes. The royal household issues a decree in 1851 specifying that all future royal wedding and coronation garments must be created entirely by hand, explicitly prohibiting mechanical pearl setting or other automated finishing techniques. This decree represents both genuine commitment to craft traditions and clever protectionism for workers whose skills serve royal interests. By maintaining standards that require hand labour, the palace ensures that skilled seamstresses continue existing and perfecting techniques that royal commissions might require. It's paternalistic and self-interested, but it does provide some employment stability for elite craftspeople like yourself, creating a floor below which the market for your skills won't fall regardless of what happens in commercial sectors. But you understand, with clear-eyed realism that comes from watching industry transformation, that royal patronage alone can't sustain the entire community of skilled textile workers. There simply aren't enough royal commissions to employ more than a small fraction of the seamstresses who trained in the old methods and depend on their skills for survival. The decree protects a fortunate few, yourself included, while doing nothing with a majority who'll be displaced or forced to adapt as mechanization advances. You're grateful for the protection while recognizing its limitations and its arbitrariness. You've been lucky in your timing and placement, not necessarily more talented or deserving than colleagues who end up with fewer options and less favorable outcomes. The machines continue improving, the imitations become more sophisticated, and the world keeps changing regardless of individual preferences or resistance. You adapt because that's what survival requires. Maintaining your hand skills while acknowledging that you're practicing a slowly dying art that will eventually be completely mechanized or abandoned. The pearls you stitch by hand in 1851 are qualitatively indistinguishable from those you stitched on Victoria's dress in 1840, but the context has changed completely. What was once mainstream professional practice is becoming specialized niche service, valuable precisely because it's rare and unnecessary, appreciated by clients who can afford to care about craftsmanship for its own sake rather than purely functional concerns. You continue working, continue perfecting your craft, continue finding satisfaction in skills that the world increasingly sees as obsolete. Because ultimately, the value of work can't be reduced to its market price or its practical necessity. Sometimes things matter simply because they're beautiful and difficult and human, even when machines can approximate them adequately for most purposes. The wedding of Princess Diana to Prince Charles in 1981 resurrects pearl embellishment traditions that had fallen somewhat out of fashion during the mid-20th century, when modernist aesthetics favoured cleaner lines and less ornamentation. Diana's dress, designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, features approximately 10,000 hand-sewn sequins and pearls adorning ivory silk taffeta, creating a romantic, fairy tale aesthetic that simultaneously honoured historical traditions and announced a new era of royal wedding spectacle. The dress's 25-foot train remains one of the longest in royal wedding history, and its elaborate construction required a team of skilled embroiderers working for months to complete, demonstrating that despite mechanization and changing fashion sensibilities, certain royal occasions still demanded the kind of labour-intensive handwork that would have been familiar to seamstresses in Victoria's era. You're not alive to see Diana's wedding. You died in 1873, aged 66. Your eyes nearly blind from decades of close work. Your hands twisted with arthritis that made holding a needle increasingly difficult during your final years. But if you could somehow observe Diana's dress from your Victorian perspective, you'd recognise the fundamental continuity beneath surface differences. The techniques for attaching pearls and sequins haven't changed as dramatically as the surrounding technology might suggest. A needle still passes through fabric and ornament. Thread still secures decorative elements to their substrate. And human judgment still determines placement and effect in ways that resist complete mechanization even 140 years after Victoria's wedding. The Diana phenomenon is particularly interesting because it reveals how royal wedding dresses function as cultural texts that communicate messages far beyond their immediate ceremonial purposes. Diana's dress was seen by an estimated 750 million television viewers worldwide, making it possibly the most viewed garment in human history up to that point. The pearl and sequin embellishments that might have taken months of skilled labour to create were visible for only seconds in most television shots. Yet their presence was essential to achieving the overall effect of romantic luxury that the dress successfully communicated. This disconnect between labour investment and viewer experience would be familiar to you. You spent months stitching pearls that most wedding guests saw for mere moments as Victoria processed past them. The Emanuels employed traditional hand embroidery techniques for the pearl and sequin work specifically because mechanised alternatives, while faster and cheaper, couldn't achieve the subtle irregularity and organic flow the hand placement provides. This is precisely the argument Mrs. Bettinson made in 1848 when defending handwork against mechanical competition machines create regularity. But sometimes, irregularity is what makes something beautiful and alive rather than merely correct. The Emanuels understood this principle, as do most designers working at the highest levels of couture, where the small imperfections of hand craftsmanship signal authenticity and care in ways that mechanical perfection cannot replicate. Princess Catherine's wedding to Prince William in 2011 took a notably different approach, with her Alexander McQueen dress by Sarah Burton featuring relatively restrained embellishment compared to Diana's extravaganza. Catherine's dress emphasised lace appliqué and structural elegance over pearl profusion, reflecting both her personal aesthetic and the somewhat more subdued sensibility of 21st century royal fashion. The lace motifs were hand-cut and hand-stitched onto the silk tulle and organza, requiring hundreds of hours of work by skilled artisans at the Royal School of Needlework. While pearls weren't absent, Catherine wore pearl earrings, and the dress featured some pearl button details. They weren't the primary decorative element, the way they were for Victoria or Diana. Do you sense the shift in priorities from Victoria's nationalist statement through British materials and craftsmanship, to Diana's romantic fantasy, to Catherine's understated elegance? Each dress reflected not just personal taste but broader cultural values about what royal weddings should communicate and represent. The continuity lies in the expectation of hand craftsmanship at the highest levels, the recognition that certain garments deserve the kind of skilled labour that machines can't fully replicate. The change lies in what specific aesthetic those skilled hands are being asked to create, and what messages the resulting garments are meant to convey to audiences that have expanded from aristocratic wedding guests to global television viewership. Meghan Markle's wedding dress in 2018, designed by Claire Waite Keller for Givenchy, represented perhaps the most minimalist approach of any major royal wedding in modern history. The dress featured almost no embellishment, no pearls, no sequins, no elaborate embroidery, relying instead on the purity of its line and the quality of its silk fabric to make its statement. This choice was itself a message, rejecting the traditional pearl and lace aesthetic in favour of modernist restraint, and it generated significant commentary and analysis about what Meghan's rejection of traditional royal wedding aesthetics meant for her relationship with royal protocols and expectations. The 5-metre veil, however, featured hand-embroidered flowers representing the Commonwealth nations, demonstrating that even in minimalist design, certain elements still required the kind of detailed handwork that connects contemporary royal garments to their historical predecessors. The persistence of hand embroidery in royal context, despite complete mechanization in commercial fashion, is fascinating from a labour and economics perspective. By 2018, machines could create embroidery and embellishment of such sophistication that most viewers couldn't distinguish it from handwork. Yet royal commissions still specify hand craftsmanship, not because machines are technically inadequate, but because the cultural meaning of handmade carries value that mechanical production cannot replicate. This represents a complete reversal from Victoria's era, when handwork was the default and machines were the threatening innovation. Now machines are ubiquitous and handwork is the expensive, rare exception, valued precisely for its inefficiency and its connection to human skill and tradition. Historians studying the evolution of royal wedding fashion note several recurring themes across centuries. First, the expectation of exceptional craftsmanship, whether that means pearl-covered surfaces or perfect minimalist seams. The standard is always the absolute best that current techniques can achieve. Second, the use of wedding dresses as political and cultural statements that extend far beyond the personal preferences of the bride wearing them. Third, the tension between tradition and innovation, with each generation trying to honour historical precedents while also creating something distinctively of its moment. And fourth, the consistent undervaluation and under-recognition of the skilled workers, overwhelmingly women whose labour makes these spectacular garments possible. The Royal School of Needlework, which worked on Catherine's dress and has been involved in numerous royal commissions over the past century, represents an institutional attempt to preserve traditional textile skills that market forces alone wouldn't sustain. The school trains new generations of embroiderers and lace makers in historical techniques, maintaining skills that would otherwise die out as older practitioners retire or die. This preservation work is valuable and admirable, creating pathways for people passionate about traditional crafts to develop expertise. But it also reveals how marginal these skills have become. They require institutional support and protection because they're no longer economically viable as purely commercial practices in most contexts. The digitization of historical royal garments, including Victoria's wedding dress, allows contemporary designers and scholars to study construction techniques and design choices in extraordinary detail. High-resolution photography, X-ray analysis, and other conservation technologies reveal how Victorian seamstresses attached pearls, constructed seams, and solved structural problems. This knowledge informs contemporary practice, allowing modern craftspeople to learn from historical examples even when direct apprenticeship chains have been broken. You would be simultaneously pleased and unsettled by this development, pleased that your work and that of your colleagues is being studied and valued. Unsettled by how thoroughly you're being examined by people you never imagined would care about the precise angle at which you threaded a needle through lace. The economic value of historical royal wedding dresses has increased dramatically over time, not as wearable garments, but as artefacts with historical and cultural significance. Victoria's dress, carefully preserved since 1840, is essentially priceless, not because the materials are intrinsically valuable, though the pearls alone represent substantial worth, but because of its historical importance and the impossibility of replacing it if damaged. This transformation from garment to artifact to priceless cultural treasure is complete by the 21st century, with the dress existing primarily as an object of study and display rather than something anyone would consider wearing. The pearls you stitched have achieved a kind of immortality, though not in any form you would have anticipated or probably desired. Contemporary discussions about royal wedding fashion often include considerations of sustainability and ethics that would have been largely foreign to Victorian sensibilities. Where is the fabric sourced? What are the labour conditions for workers creating the garments? What's the environmental impact of producing something that will be worn once? These questions reflect growing awareness of the costs, human and environmental, of luxury consumption, an awareness that complicates the simple admiration of beautiful objects that characterized earlier eras. Modern royal brides face pressure to make choices that acknowledge these concerns, while still fulfilling ceremonial expectations for spectacular display. It's a difficult balance, requiring more conscious ethical consideration than Victoria or Diana faced. The Hash Me Too movement and increased attention to workplace conditions in fashion industries have also prompted more scrutiny of how garment workers, including those creating royal commissions, are treated and compensated. The romantic narrative of skilled artisans lovingly crafting magnificent dresses is being complicated by honest examination of exploitation, inadequate compensation, and unsafe working conditions that persist in many fashion production contexts. The workers who created Catherine's and Meghan's dresses were presumably treated far better than you and your colleagues in Mrs. Bettinson's workshop, with reasonable hours, proper compensation, and legal protections that didn't exist in Victorian England. But even contemporary high fashion production isn't free from labour issues, and the distance between romanticised narratives of craftsmanship and actual working conditions remains significant. If you could somehow observe royal wedding fashion across the 180 years since you worked on Victoria's dress, what would strike you most? Probably the continuity more than the change. Yes, the specific aesthetics have evolved. Television has transformed the audience, and the cultural context has shifted dramatically. But the fundamental dynamic remains remarkably consistent wealthy. Powerful families using skilled workers' labour to create garments that communicate status and meaning, with those workers receiving wages but not recognition, creating objects that outlive them but not in ways that preserve their names or stories. The technology has advanced, social attitudes have evolved, and specific fashion preferences have changed. But the basic structure of who creates, who wears, who's remembered and who's forgotten, that structure would be depressingly familiar across nearly 2 centuries of royal wedding dress production. The pearls you stitched onto Victoria's dress still exist, still gleam with subtle lustre when the dress is occasionally displayed, still perform their function of catching light and creating beauty. They've outlasted you by more than a century, and will probably outlast your great-great-great-grandchildren if the current preservation protocols continue. But they exist now as artifacts of history rather than objects of fashion, studied by scholars and conservators, photographed by researchers, protected behind security and climate control. They've achieved a kind of permanence you never imagined, though stripped of the context and purpose for which they were created. The dress is no longer a dress. Not really. It's a document, a text, a piece of evidence about Victorian culture and craftsmanship. And the pearls you stitched are words in that text, contributing meaning you never intended to conversation you never imagined. The immortality of objects is strange and imperfect, but it's the only immortality most of us makers and made things alike ever get. The handful of master seamstresses still practicing traditional pearl attachment techniques in the 21st century work in conditions you would barely recognise, surrounded by technology that would seem like magic from your Victorian perspective, yet performing essentially the same hand movements you perfected nearly 2 centuries ago. They sit at workstations with adjustable LED lighting that provides illumination far superior to anything you experienced, with ergonomic chairs designed to minimize the back and shoulder strain that plagued you throughout your career, with magnifying devices that spare their eyes the worst of the strain that eventually blinded you. But the needle still passes through pearl and fabric in the same fundamental way, guided by human judgment about placement and tension that even the most sophisticated machines still can't fully replicate for the most demanding applications. These contemporary artisans are rare enough to be treated as living treasures, their names known in fashion circles, their services sought by the handful of haute couture houses still committed to hand craftsmanship at the highest levels. They teach workshops and masterclasses, training students in techniques that have been refined over centuries, maintaining chains of knowledge transmission that connect today's practitioners back through generations to you and your colleagues in Mrs. Bettinson's workshop. When a master embroiderer named Emma Thompson demonstrates pearl attachment technique at the Royal School of Needlework in 2023, she's performing actions that would be instantly recognisable to you despite the 183 years separating your eras. The continuity of hand skills across technological revolutions is profound and moving for those who understand its significance. The economic model sustaining these traditional practitioners is completely different from anything you experienced. They're not employees in workshops like Mrs. Bettinson's, dependent on commissions and vulnerable to market fluctuations. Instead, they're independent specialists who collaborate with designers on specific projects, command fees that reflect their scarcity and expertise, and often supplement their client work with teaching, writing, and institutional relationships that provide income stability. This structure gives them autonomy and security you never enjoyed, though it also requires business and self-promotion skills that pure craftsmanship doesn't provide. They're simultaneously artists, teachers, business people, and craftspeople, a combination of roles that Victorian class structures would have made nearly impossible. The motivations bringing people to traditional pearl embroidery in the contemporary era differ significantly from what drove you and your colleagues. You entered the profession because it offered one of the few pathways for women to earn decent wages through skilled labour in Victorian England. Your modern counterparts often come from more privileged backgrounds and choose embroidery despite having other professional options. Drawn by passion for craftsmanship and desire to preserve traditional techniques rather than by economic necessity. This shift from necessity to choice changes the meaning of the work it's pursued for fulfillment and artistic satisfaction rather than survival, which makes it simultaneously less urgent and more creatively liberating. Do you sense how the relationship between hand skills and value has transformed? In your era, handwork was the default and its value was primarily functional. You were paid to create beautiful objects because that's what clients needed and machines couldn't yet provide. In the contemporary era, handwork has become exceptional and its value is primarily symbolic. Clients pay premium prices not because machines can't create adequate results, but because handwork carries cultural meanings about authenticity, tradition, luxury, and human connection that mechanical production cannot replicate. The actual pearl attachments you created and those created by 21st century embroiderers are functionally similar, but their cultural significance and economic value operate in completely different systems. The social media documentation of contemporary hand embroidery creates visibility for craft processes that were largely invisible in your time. When a master embroiderer posts time-lapse videos showing hours of pearl attachment work compressed into 60 seconds of footage, viewed by hundreds of thousands of people worldwide, they're making visible labour that clients in your era never witnessed and probably never thought about. This visibility generates appreciation for craft skills, but also creates new pressures and expectations. The work must be simultaneously technically excellent and visually compelling for social media audiences. Photogenic in ways that weren't relevant when the only viewers would be the client and perhaps a few aristocratic guests at a wedding or ball. The feminist reclamation of textile crafts as artistically and culturally significant represents a profound shift from Victorian attitudes that often dismissed needlework as merely decorative women's work rather than serious artistic practice. Contemporary scholars, curators, and practitioners argue forcefully that textile crafts deserve the same respect and institutional support as painting, sculpture, or other arts traditionally dominated by men. This revaluation means that work like yours, which you probably thought of primarily as skilled labour rather than fine art, is now studied, exhibited, and celebrated in museums and galleries. You're being retrospectively granted artistic status that you were denied during your lifetime, though you're not alive to benefit from or even know about this recognition. The preservation and study of Victorian garments by contemporary institutions serves multiple purposes beyond simply maintaining historical artifacts. Conservators learn about historical construction techniques that inform contemporary practice. Fashion historians analyse how clothing reflected and shaped social relationships and cultural values. Museums display these garments to educate the public about historical craftsmanship and material culture. And occasionally, contemporary designers study historical examples for inspiration, creating modern interpretations that reference traditional aesthetics and techniques. Victoria's wedding dress, which you helped create for a single ceremonial occasion, has become an educational resource that continues generating knowledge and influence nearly 2 centuries after its creation. The training institutions preserving traditional embroidery skills face constant challenges securing funding and attracting students in an era where technology careers offer more obvious paths to financial security. The Royal School of Needlework, hand and lock and embroidery company founded in 1767 that still operates today, and similar organisations depend on a mix of commercial commissions, educational programs, grants, and donations to maintain their operations. They're preserving skills that market forces alone wouldn't sustain, which raises questions about the relationship between cultural value and economic viability. If something is culturally valuable but economically unsustainable, who's responsible for preserving it? And what obligations do societies have to maintain craft traditions that aren't commercially self-sufficient? The most accomplished contemporary practitioners of pearl embroidery are predominantly women, maintaining the gender dynamics of the craft that have persisted since long before your era. But the contemporary context includes more explicit recognition of how textile crafts have been undervalued partially because they were women's work, and more conscious efforts to combat this devaluation through institutional support, proper compensation, and cultural recognition. The modern embroiderers working on royal commissions or haute couture projects are paid substantially better relative to overall wage structures than you were. Though disparities remain between compensation for textile crafts versus other artistic practices, progress has occurred, but full equity hasn't been achieved. The question of what happens when the last master practitioners of traditional techniques die or retire without having trained sufficient successors haunts contemporary craft communities. Some skills have already been lost because knowledge transmission chains were broken techniques that were common in your era, but weren't documented thoroughly enough for modern practitioners to reconstruct from written or photographic records alone. The embroidery community is urgently documenting traditional techniques through video, detailed written instructions, and hands-on apprenticeships, trying to preserve knowledge that exists primarily in the muscle memory and tacit understanding of aging practitioners. This is a race against time and mortality, attempting to capture knowledge before it disappears with the people who hold it. Historians studying your era's textile production face significant challenges because so much work was done by anonymous seamstresses whose names and stories weren't preserved. The garments survive in museum collections, and sometimes client correspondence or workshop ledgers provide fragmentary information about production contexts. but the actual makers, women like you, left few personal records and received minimal contemporary documentation. This historical invisibility makes it difficult to fully understand the human experiences behind the objects, reducing skilled craftswomen to anonymous background labour rather than recognised historical actors whose work and lives deserve attention. Contemporary scholars work to recover these stories where possible, piecing together fragmentary evidence to create more complete pictures of historical craft production. The psychological and emotional experiences of contemporary traditional embroiderers differ in some ways from what you experienced, but show surprising continuities in others. Modern practitioners describe the meditative quality of repetitive, precise work, the satisfaction of solving technical challenges, the pride of creating genuinely beautiful objects, and the frustration when clients don't fully appreciate the skill and time invested in hand craftsmanship. These feelings would be entirely familiar to you. The core experience of dedicated craft practice transcends specific historical contexts. The attention required, the connection between hand and eye and mind, the slow accumulation of small, precise actions into finished work. These aspects of the practice remain essentially unchanged across nearly 2 centuries. The environmental arguments for preserving and practicing traditional hand techniques have gained prominence in recent decades as awareness of fashion industry waste and pollution has increased. Hand embroidery typically uses minimal energy beyond human metabolism, generates little waste, and creates garments designed to last decades or longer, rather than being disposable fast fashion items. This sustainability profile makes traditional techniques attractive to designers and clients concerned about environmental impact, creating market opportunities that didn't exist when environmental considerations weren't significant factors in purchasing decisions. Traditional skills are being preserved partially for cultural and aesthetic reasons, but also increasingly for sustainability arguments that frame hand craftsmanship as ecologically responsible in ways that industrialized fashion production often isn't. The digital documentation and analysis of historical embroidery techniques using tools like microscopy, X-ray fluorescence, and high-resolution photography reveal details about your work that even you probably didn't consciously attend to while performing it. Researchers can examine exactly how you threaded needles through pearls and fabric, the precise angles and tensions of your stitches, the patterns of variation that distinguish your work from that of your colleagues. This forensic level of analysis treats your craftsmanship as scientific evidence, extracting information you never intended to communicate and probably never imagined anyone would seek. The pearls you stitched are being interrogated by technologies that would seem like sorcery from your perspective, yielding insights about Victorian craft practice that illuminate both technical processes and the human hands that executed them. If you could somehow know that nearly 2 centuries after your death, people still study and practice the techniques you devoted your life to mastering, what would you feel pride? Certainly your skills mattered enough to be worth preserving across generations. Perhaps surprised that hand embroidery survived at all given the technological transformations that have occurred. Maybe satisfaction that your work contributed to traditions larger and more enduring than your individual life. But also possibly sadness that the preservation efforts are necessary precisely because these skills have become endangered, no longer passed naturally through economic necessity, but requiring deliberate institutional intervention to prevent complete loss. The monastery quiet ateliers where contemporary master embroiderers train their successors aren't so different in atmosphere from Mrs. Bettinson's workshop, the same concentration, the same careful attention to detail, the same understanding that excellence requires patience and complete focus. The specific tools have improved and the cultural context has transformed, but the fundamental character of the work remains recognizable. When a student learning pearl attachment in 2023 struggles with the same challenges you faced in 1840, keeping thread tension consistent, positioning pearls at exactly the right angles, maintaining focus despite fatigue, they're participating in experiences that connect them to you across the vast gap of time and change. The continuity of difficulty, the persistence of challenges that only human skill and patience can overcome, creates bridges between eras that transcend surface differences. You died in 1873, your hands too damaged to hold needles, your eyes too weak to see the fine work that had defined your adult life. You were buried in an unmarked pauper's grave, your savings depleted by medical expenses during your final illness. No family wealthy enough to provide a proper memorial. The pearls you stitched onto Victoria's dress survived you and have now survived multiple generations of your descendants, assuming you had any. They gleam in their climate-controlled storage, occasionally displayed to museum visitors, photographed by researchers, studied by students learning traditional techniques. The pearls are immortal in ways you never were, carrying forward your skill and attention into futures you couldn't imagine. This is perhaps the closest thing to legacy that most craftspeople achieve, not personal remembrance, but the survival of work and technique. Anonymous contributions to traditions larger than individual lives. The pearls shimmer softly in darkness or light, indifferent to who placed them there, perfect in their own material way, containing within their lustrous surfaces the accumulated skill of centuries of hands that prepared oysters, drilled holes, sorted by size and colour, and finally stitched them into patterns that communicate meanings about beauty, wealth, power, and the strange persistence of human effort across time's erosive flow. And now, as we reach the end of our journey through generations of pearl-stitching hands, let yourself settle more deeply into comfort. The needles are finally at rest. The pearls lie quiet in their vaults, waiting in darkness that holds no anxiety, only the patient certainty of objects that have outlived their makers. You've travelled through workshops lit by candlelight and LED, through fingers that ached in Victorian cold and modern ergonomic warmth, through the same essential gesture repeated across nearly 2 centuries, the needle passing through the pearl, the thread securing beauty to fabric, the human hand maintaining connection to tradition despite every technological transformation. The seamstresses sleep now, all of them, from Mrs. Bettinson to the contemporary masters, their work surviving them in museums and private collections, in techniques passed hand to hand, in pearls that gleam with the accumulated attention of generations. Their names are mostly forgotten, but their skill persists, woven into traditions that continue despite market forces and mechanical competition. Despite the constant pressure to replace human touch with mechanical precision, let your breathing slow like the patient rhythm of needle through fabric. In and through and out again. The repetitive meditation of craft that connects past and present. Skill and beauty. Effort and rest. The pearls contain within their surfaces all the hands that place them, all the eyes that judge their placement perfect, all the hours of concentration compressed into small luminous spheres that ask nothing, prove nothing, simply exist as evidence of care taken, attention paid, beauty created through the accumulation of precise small actions. And as sleep finds you, as your own hands relax completely, remember that the pearls are still there, still gleaming softly in their darkness, patient as stone, containing light, waiting for no one, perfect in their own quiet way as you drift deeper into rest that requires nothing, expects nothing, offers only peace.